Hello, my fellow Westorians. Welcome back. I'm Aziz. With me, as always, is Shae, and this is Valar Rereadis, where we look for the foreshadowing we missed, new depth in the world building, a better understanding of the plot lines, a greater familiarity with the characters, not great pronunciation though, apparently, and more fun than you can fit in all 7 hells. This week we have Catelyn 9. The gang meets the Freys, aka the one where Robb trades a crossing for a marriage.
Jon 8, the one where Aemon reveals his past, aka the gang gives Jon Valyrian steel.
Daenerys 7, the one where Khal Drogo is wounded, aka the gang meets Mirri Duur.
Tyrion 8, the one with the Battle of the Green Fork, aka the gang meets Shae.
Catelyn 10, the gang fights in the Whispering Woods, aka the one where they capture Jaime.
Daenerys 8, the one where Mirri uses blood magic, aka the gang fights Drogo's Bloodriders.
And Arya 5, the one where they execute Ned, aka the one where we learned how different this series really was. We're nearing the end of Game of Thrones. As I said last time, this episode, or rather these last 2 episodes, are really dominated by Daenerys. There's a lot of final chapters for a lot of characters, mostly in this next episode. We had Ned's final chapter last time. We have Arya's final chapter this time. And we'll have the final chapters for Sansa, Tyrion, Catelyn, well, everyone next time, everyone else. And Daenerys will be the one with the most chapters, though. She's got 4 of these last batch. But there's, of course, major things happening outside of Daenerys' chapters, obviously. A few quick announcements since we've been off for a little while. It's really nice to get back to the status quo, doing podcasts regularly with y'all. We did have our long journey to Ireland and returned home to Atlanta for Dragon Con, right? All in a row there. We did a podcast describing our adventures, including conversations with George R. R. Martin, a few new tidbits, a few new pieces of world building and information that y'all will find interesting, as well as some filming locations and just some good times. Well, that episode is not on our podcast feed. It's YouTube only, and that's because it's filled with pictures and videos. It is a video. Most of our episodes, the vast, vast majority of our episodes, are both video and podcast, but this one is highly visual, so it's going to stay on YouTube only. So if you want to check it out, you know where to find it, Westeros History YouTube channel. Also, timestamps and fun titles have been added to the earlier podcast version episode, so you can easily find a specific chapter. For example, I went back and named the prologue, The Gang Meets the Others, aka the one with Sir Waymar's dance class. And so, like I said, timestamps, you can look at the podcast description and see the timestamp for each episode. That's true for most of the videos as well. We're still finishing up the last couple of sets of timestamps on those. Now, the same is true if you're on the members feed for Patreon, which we call the Vault. Anyone who signs up for Patreon gets access to the same thing. All those episodes have been updated with timestamps. But also, if you're a patron, very soon you'll get a bonus episode, which is an edit of all 15 Eddard chapters as one episode. So if you want to go back and listen to Valar Rereadis again with a different focus, you'll be able to do just Eddard chapters or just Arya chapters, which will be up next. And that'll be true for all the POVs by book. So, of course, by the end of A Game of Thrones, we'll be posting the full chapter versions of each POV. So there'll be a Tyrion batch, there'll be all 11 Catelyn chapters in one batch, etc. So you can re-listen to these, or if you haven't listened yet, you can do it that way. Shout out to Girls Gone Canon, whose podcast is based around that format. They have done all the Ned chapters already, and they're doing, who are they on right now? They're on Jon right now, and it's going really well. So check them out if you want another look at this style format. Of course, also when you join Patreon, you get the Gagossos bonus episode, the Aziz versus A Dance with Dragons epilogue episode, and the Aziz versus Pate prologue episode, in addition to some other bonus content from Valar Rereadis. We've got a couple of Where Are They Now episodes. There's a couple of panels from past Con of Thrones that we never put up on the main feed, and other stuff like that. Lots of good bonus material, and that's just one benefit to signing up for Patreon. So if you are so inclined, head on over to patreon.com, History of Westeros, and find the level that fits best for you. But any level gets you into the semi-private feeds and gets you the bonus episodes. All right, I think the one we're going to spend the most time on is this first one, Catelyn 9. And it's interesting that that's the one that came out to be the longest. I think maybe it's just because, some of these are battles. We're talking about a lot of battles. Battles don't have as much foreshadowing. We have plenty to say about them. There is some foreshadowing. There's characterizations that come up later. But in some ways, there's less to say about them. But, of course, there's surprises in the things we find to talk about every once in a while. Because, before we recap the chapter, before we reread it, we don't always know what we're going to find. So let's do it. Catelyn 9, the gang meets the Freys, a.k.a. the one where Robb trades a crossing for a marriage. It's the one where we first start to see the Blackfish's major impact as a commander and head of scouts, killing both enemy scouts and ravens from the twins, while also being the man responsible for looking for other ways across the river, which he does not find. The first line of the chapter is right here.
As the host trooped down the causeway through the black bogs of the neck and spilled out into the riverlands beyond, Catelyn's apprehensions grew.
Their precarious position strategically is one of the many things bothering Cat, but of course there is so much more. I mean, it's war. I mean, of course, there's plenty of reasons to feel apprehensive, but not only that, they're outnumbered, and Robb is in charge. She's worried about him as a son, worried about him with his inexperience, just lots to worry about. Can't blame her. Now, Dany has betrayal in her future told to her by prophecy, but the signs for the Starks are just as ominous here, though less magical, less apparent in that sense. They're probably a bit more subtle. But on reread, they really stand out. I think the first time through, it's hard to catch them. But this time, it's there. It's there all over. Theon's penchant for making light of death continues here and will continue throughout the rest of the book and into the next book until he's Ramsayed. And this is paired with Cat's worries about her family. In this one, the seeds for beating the Lannisters in the field were sown, but also the seeds for the Red Wedding, though at the time it wasn't a sure thing. Well, it was in the sense that George had planned to write it from the beginning, but not in the sense of, in world where everything just had to go a certain way. And all while Theon's shadow hangs over Winterfell.
Do you think he means to betray us to the Lannisters, my lady? Robert Glover asked gravely. Catelyn sighed. If truth be told, I doubt even Lord Frey knows what Lord Frey intends to do. He has an old man's caution and a young man's ambition, and has never lacked for cunning.
Looking ahead from this dialogue, Cat proves far more accurate in reading Walder Frey than she does Littlefinger, saying that she doubts even he knows what he will do, while saying it will come down to ambition and cunning is a bullseye take. That's exactly what he does. She mentions his pride as a major factor later, and that is very true, perhaps the most important factor, really. He doesn't like that some of the other lords look down on the Freys, and the Lannisters are a major source of that, given how much Tywin looks down on everyone, really. Walder would not have betrayed Robb if not for the marriage to Jane Westerling, most likely. That was a matter of pride and ambition, as Walder was insulted by the broken promise, Robb's choice of what was, in his mind, a lesser house, and the loss of the opportunity to be part of the royal family in a new kingdom. So that was a lot, if you care about pride and ambition, those are big things to lose. But that's fairly straightforward. It's all out in the open for the most part. We don't really need to get into deep analysis of why Walder Frey was upset. Less straightforward is the choice of Robert Glover as Cat's dialogue partner here. I want to draw your attention to that. Now, with Theon close by, we have many of the elements for the later northern plots spearheaded by Wyman Manderly and Robert Glover himself. Though Robert's brother Galbart is Lord of Deepwood Motte, he, meaning Galbart, has no children and is unmarried. So Robert is the heir, and Robert's son Gawain is next. However, Robert's family is captive on the Iron Islands where things stand now. They were taken by Asha, who sent them off to House Harlaw's seat of 10 Towers, which is held by the Reader. Robert may not know where Galbart is either at the moment, though he likely still lives. Galbart will later be part of the group sent into the Neck to find Howland Reed. Robb sends him there with Robb's true will while carrying false copies of that will. So we expect that Robb's instructions were to name Jon king in the North. But right now, we don't know where Galbart or his companions are. Mage Mormont's with him as well, and that's a kind of a mystery. So both the Glovers are looking to be important in TWOW because, like I just said, Galbart is carrying this important information, and Robert, well, As we well know, Asha later lost the Glover seat of Deepwood Motte and her freedom to Stannis, who also has Theon as a captive. So it's just, like I said, all this comes back around. And why is this so important for Robert Glover? Well, because, like I said, he's the heir to Deepwood Motte. It's his family's seat. It's his family that's been captured by Asha. And so Stannis having Asha is possibly a way for them to do an exchange. But he's the man who escorts Davos to Wyman Manderly's secret chamber where that North Remembers scene take place. That uber popular, perhaps most popular of all chapters, according to the polls on Tower of the Hand. Robert is very grateful to Stannis for retaking his seat, though obviously he's still in great fear over his family being captives of the Ironborn, rather. Recall, too, that in that scene with Wyman and Davos and Robert Glover, the fourth person is Wex Pike, Theon's squire. So again, another connection back to this moment. So many of the other important players speak up here too. Galbert Glover talks just like Robert, plus Wendell and Willis Manderly and Roose Bolton and the Great John and Rickard Karstark. Quote,
Roose Bolton nodded. Go in there alone and you're his. He can sell you to the Lannisters, throw you in a dungeon, or slit your throat as he likes.
Roose knows how a dirty player would play, after all. He's a good person to go for advice. What's the dirtiest thing someone could do right here? Let's ask Roose Bolton. And of course, talking about selling him back to the Lannisters, that's exactly what Roose does to Jaime. He sells him back to Tywin with the promise that, hey, remember that I did this. I'm doing you a favor. And of course, when he does that, he's selling out the Starks, so to speak. And for him in particular, there is this quote from Cat that nails it, really nails it.
Did you teach him wisdom as well as valor, Ned? She wondered. Did you teach him how to kneel? The graveyards of the Seven Kingdoms were full of brave men who had never learned that lesson.
So yeah, that's about Robb, of course. She's worried about her son and how he's gonna deal with all this. And it does seem that Ned taught him battle wisdom, and that served him well. Robb was too much his father's son in ways that harmed him later, perhaps. In fact, this bit we just talked about with regards to Jane Westerling. But that's really relevant to thinking about Ned's own shame over Jon Snow. We don't know what Robb ever thought of Jon and his father and Ashara, or whoever Robb thought Jon's mother was. He certainly had his own opinion and his own thoughts, but as the one Stark child, other than Rickon, who we don't have a POV on, we never really know what he thinks about all that. And we don't really know what goes through his head when he decides to marry Jane. But, marry Jane. But he does certainly have thoughts on it, and likely the way his father carried himself impacted those decisions. So when we get to that, we'll dive a little deeper into how Robb perceived how his father would handle such a thing. But I want to bring it up now because, well, it's with Robb the whole time. Robb's acting like his father is a big part of who he is, and how his father taught him, how he emulates him is a huge part of everything. So we want to know whether he was disappointed in how his father handled Jon, or whether he thought it was proper, or whether he thought his father deserved a pass for breaking his honor because he's so honorable all the other times, or if that's some big stain on who he is. Now, it's also not just their own honor, because, of course, in Robb's case, he didn't want to dishonor Jane. And how he treats his wife, or his wife-to-be in that case, also reflects on how Ned treated women in his life, because that's Robb's main influence. So I think there's a lot to be said about that, but there's also a lot of it mysterious because we don't really know what Robb thought. So his own pledge to Jane and his own sense of duty to the Freys and all that is a really interesting back and forth and something to keep in mind. But in this line, at the end of the chapter, she perhaps trusts her son a bit too much. Quote,
He had never seemed more manly to her than he did in that moment. Boys might play with swords, but it took a lord to make a marriage pact, knowing what it meant.
Robb clearly does not grasp the enormity of a pact with Walder Frey. He does not understand how proud Walder is, and does not know the power of pride in a man that is so holding tight to his pride. Before the Red Wedding, the Freys do fight bravely and in great numbers for Robb. Walder may have had in the back of his mind that this may not work out. He may have always had an out planned, but his commitment was full, at the time. It just changed based on circumstances. Now, let's take a look at Walder a bit here, some conversations. Walder yells at his heir Stevron here.
Father, Ser Stevron said reproachfully, you forget yourself. Lady Stark is here at your invitation. Did I ask you? You are not Lord Frey yet, not until I die. Do I look dead? I'll hear no instructions from you.
Stevron seems like a legitimate good person. This is not good Frey, bad Frey. Stevron is like this all the time. Had Lord Walder died, Stevron would have been Lord and would have stayed loyal to Robb, probably. Maybe not. He would have been upset about the marriage breaking of the broken marriage pact as well, but I doubt he would have done this. He wouldn't have done the Red Wedding. I don't think he's that kind of guy. He would have chosen a more honorable way to express his displeasure. He might have been okay with the Edmure marriage instead. That might have been fine. I feel he would have balked at the Red Wedding. I mean, it's a really big deal. Breaking guest right and all that, setting their family up to be remembered this way for generations, if not forever, effectively forever. So who knows? But in any case, he died from wounds suffered in battle, fighting for Robb. Somewhat mysteriously, by the way, since his wounds are mentioned to not be so bad. But something happened. A theory I subscribe to as very possible is that Black Walder, who was on the campaign too, helped Stevron along to his death somehow to move up in the line of succession. At the time, this is not much of a theory, meaning right here where we are in a Game of Thrones. But over time, almost everyone in Black Walder's path has died. So Black Walder very much rising through the ranks of the Frey heirs there.
Oh, Black Walder, ram-a-lam-a-lam.
Nice. But that's a story for later. More Black Walder is coming later when Black Walder gets going. But right now we're just setting the stage. Now, Kat's offer to make herself the hostage is brave and correct, I think. I think it was the best move given circumstances, and recognizing that it's correct and taking that risk on herself is brave. And her analysis of the situation is another bullseye. It's neat that Perwyn is her counterpart as the Frey hostage. They do like a little hostage exchange. Not only was he the one left by his family as a hostage here, but he was not invited to the Red Wedding. He's made of nobler stuff than most of his kin. He takes after Stevron, perhaps, or Olivar, ones who liked Robb or who weren't the type of character to do something so dirty. And of course, his family knows that. They knew he would not take part, and they thought maybe he was a liability, including him in the plan. They didn't want to take any risk that he would tell. So I admit, before I knew what a bloody scumbag Walder Frey was, a part of me liked how blunt he was in his conversation with Kat. So over time, well, I didn't really like him, but I still appreciate the bluntness of his conversation as far as how revealing it is. Now, of course, I don't mean the gross parts about his far too young wife, who, by the way, is probably sleeping with Black Walder. But again, that's another topic for another time. But it's not lines like this either. I'm not a fan of this, although it's noteworthy.
Now my bastards presume to teach me courtesy, Lord Walder complained. I'll speak any way I like, damn you. I've had 3 kings to guest in my life, and queens as well. Do you think I require lessons from the likes of you, Rhaegar?
No. See, I don't think he does. But the part I like is cutting to the chase with regard to the problem of conflicting vows. This is really good stuff. It's something George likes to do on occasion. He gives great points, cutting poignant logic to bad people, which makes the lesson harder to take. Quote,
why should my boys hurry south to die? All those who did go south are running north again.
From a strategic perspective, he's saying, you can't win. Though the subtext is, you can't win if I'm against you too. But you might win if I'm on your side. And he's right about that, because the Freys have a lot of people, and their help could really swing things. And Walder knows that. But this is not the cutting, poignant logic I refer to, though it is fair to call it that from a human perspective. Because while Walder's reasons might be cynical here, it's a good point that challenges Westerosi honor codes in general. Despite how normal it is for Westerosi lords to send their sons off to battle, I still find it hard to argue against this, even from a modern perspective, even if I try to take that away. It's just not correct to send your sons into battles that look potentially hopeless, no matter what time you live in. I don't think that's a overly modern thing to say. Because clearly there are people in this setting who agree with me, or who I agree with them, what might be more appropriate to say. Now, Walder says that same thing, though he doesn't make it about fear. He doesn't make it about, oh, I'm afraid to lose my sons. He just points out how bad it looks for her. Quote.
You swore an oath
Nope.
to... Oh.
Back up.
Oh, sorry. Don't you try and frighten me, my lady. Your husband's in some traitor's cell under the Red Keep. Your father's sick, might be dying, and Jaime Lannister's got your brother in chains. What do you have that I should fear? That son of yours?
Robb is actually worth fearing, as it turns out, but keep in mind that Robb's great skills have not been seen yet. To this point, he's not been in a battle. No one knows that he's some sort of commander prodigy. That's going to develop shortly. So if we set aside strategy, though, let's look to the honor side of this, as Kat does. That's the line of argument she goes with here. Quote.
You swore an oath to my father, Catelyn reminded him. He bobbed his head side to side, smiling. Oh yes, I said some words, but I swore oaths to the crown too, it seems to me. Joffrey's the king now, and that makes you and your boy and all those fools out there no better than rebels. If I had the sense the gods gave a fish, I'd help the Lannisters boil you all.
Jaime says his knightly oath to protect those who can't protect themselves conflicted with his oath to guard the king. And he's completely right. Those vows do conflict, and it's part of the problem with vows in the first place. We're all far too ignorant and naive to what the future holds to be sure what a solemn promise can't be, or to be sure that a solemn promise can't be abused or fall into conflict like this, where you have no choice but to break one or more vows in order to uphold another. So it's a really interesting point that comes up throughout several times in the Song of Ice and Fire. And arguably it comes up before this with Ned's fever dreams and, well, just Ned's sense of duty to Robert and his memories of the Tower of Joy, his duty to his sister. But this is the first time we see like a bad guy kind of bring it up. Even though, to be fair, on first read, you don't actually know Walder's a bad guy yet. But regardless, it's a really interesting theme that I think George is right to touch in on and to hone in on in other places. Like I said, Jaime is another major place this comes up when talking to Brienne. So Walder issues several more grievances about marriage alliances and how Riverrun has always looked down on him, and that, of course, is Walder's pride, the key to everything in this scene, if there's any one thing you can pin it on. Because in my opinion, turning on Robb is one thing, doing it the way he did, that's another. And in that, we see how much Walder is like Tywin, even as he denigrates him. Most things can be forgiven or amended, but the debt of pride for such men is a prime, perhaps the prime example. And George R. R. Martin drops it right on us when Lord Walder speaks of Big and Little Walder and Lysa Tully and the fostering of Sweet Robin. Quote.
She frosted up as if I'd suggested selling her boy to a mummer's show or making a eunuch out of him. And when Lord Arryn said the child was going to Dragonstone to foster with Stannis Baratheon, she stormed off without a word of regrets, and all the hand could give me was apologies. What good are apologies, I ask you?
There we have the pride bit. Apologies don't work when you're that proud. Apologies do work if you aren't that proud quite often. It just shows how selfish a person like this truly is. It's kind of a reveal. It's like, this is what your pride leads you to. Even when doing things in the name of their family, it's still this that matters the most. Not everyone in his family has the same level of pride for the name House Frey. They see pride in a different way. I mean, there's something to be said for, are you really proud of being the family that's remembered for the Red Wedding? That's just a different form of pride. So it's a very loaded passage, because by bringing up Sweet Robin's fostering, Walder is bringing up what got Jon Arryn killed, which means I don't think Lysa even cared that it was Lord Walder who would be fostering her son. This is another problem with pride. She wasn't looking down on Lord Walder. She didn't want it to be him or Stannis or Tywin. It wasn't about which lord. It was about any lord. She didn't want Sweet Robin fostered with anyone, which gave Littlefinger an opening to stoke her fears and pull her strings, saying, "Ooh, look, they're trying to take your son away. No matter what, they're going to take your son away. The only way to stop this is to murder your husband." So that's yet another issue with having an overbearing sense of pride. You see insults where there aren't any. That's Walder for you. So Kat had to dance around that and make use of Walder's pride. She had to avoid it and make use of it. And like Robb's marriage pledge and that of Arya's, plus the promise to ward Big and Little Walder, there was really no other choice. And here's another quote to show us just how ominous this scene is looking.
A swollen red sun hung low against the western hills when the gates of the castle opened.
A setting sun, the west, and red, swollen red. That's, yep, like I said, that's ominous. Theon is a constant counter to Cat's caution. He wants the easy fight. He's always talking about the glory. He's really this is a good call from Joe Buckley, saying that he's got the Boys of Summer way of thinking, something that Catelyn is going to experience a lot more of when she starts treating with Renly's army next book. Further evidence of Hoster's tutelage of Cat. This is interesting because if you recall, for a while there, Hoster thought Cat would be his heir until Edmure was born. And that comes up for some other characters who are treated as an heir until a son is born. And it just goes to show that when they get this education, these women are just as capable, if not more so, than a lot of the men out there. It's just a lot of times they aren't given that education. Well, in the case of Cat, she did have some of it, and she uses it pretty well. And there's a good catch from Joe here as well. He points out the quote, "If Lord Tywin wants my help, he can bloody well ask for it." Well, I'm not sure it's clear exactly who does the asking later on, but yeah, they do certainly work together. I'm pretty sure it might be Tywin who reaches out, but it might be Lord Walder who says, "Hey, look, after this thing happened, maybe I could switch sides." Either way, he ended up working together without too much trouble. I wonder too if Catelyn had tried the Edmure method, saying, "Hey, you talked about how you wanted to marry one of your daughters to marry Edmure for so long. Well, maybe she should have started off with that instead of going straight to Robb." Or we don't know how the negotiations went, of course. It's off page. But it's an interesting what-if scenario. Couple of random questions and add-ons here, miscellaneous bits. I noticed that the last line of the chapter is "for good or ill. Her son had thrown the dice," which I think is a little Julius Caesar meta. Robb crossed the Green Fork when doing this, and Caesar crossed the Rubicon, which is the border to the Roman Republic. It was a point of no turning back, like Robb's, because he was crossing the border, and that's like an invasion at that point. And the famous line attributed to him when he did so, meaning Caesar, is "the die is cast." So we have the dice again. Her for good or ill, her son has thrown the dice. The Rubicon is named for its red water and is shallow, which harkens to the Ruby Ford, which is on the Green Fork. And it's named for Rhaegar's rubies. So, I don't know. George is a big fan of history. He might have snuck that one in there as a little nod to Robb. There's definitely some Frey pie foreshadowing here, or at least it works as Frey pie foreshadowing here. Good catch from John Hagee in our Facebook group. The line, "Catelyn would gladly have spitted the querulous old man and roasted him over a fire." And of course, he uses this phrase, "boil," himself, that is, Walder Frey. "Wouldn't it boil them to blah, blah, blah." He says that a couple times. So there's a lot of, eating people references here on the sly. Nina Friel says Walder Frey calling on Jared to back him up is a great catch, underlying how much of a faithless bad actor he is, meaning Jared. Jared's role seems to be recurring in that he backs up outrageous lies with a straight face. Here's his biggest lie, much later in A Dance with Dragons, if you don't recall. He's the one who says this at the Merman's Court to Wyman Manderley and Davos. Quote.
You're gonna have to. The Red Wedding was the young wolf's work. He changed into a beast before our eyes and tore out the throat of my cousin Jinglebell, a harmless simpleton. He would have slain my lord father too, if Sir Wendell had not put himself in the way.
So when Nina refers to his outrageous lies, outrageous is no exaggeration. It might be an understatement. I mean, that is ridiculous, right? He changed into a beast and tore out the throat of my cousin Jinglebell. Like, wow. Yet people just have to go along with that. Wyman Mandersley is like, "Yep, I knew my son was brave." That's his response. But Davos just flat out calls him liar. And, well, he is. And Jared, of course, is also one of the ones who ends up in the Frey pies along with Rhaegar and Simon. So that's what he gets. That's his karma. Comment from our friend Mangu, who says, between Ned and Cat, they had the info that Lysa and Littlefinger lied to them about the Lannisters and Jon Arryn, but they never had time to sit down and share information, put their heads together to kind of figure all that out. Alas, they had the info, but not the time or the time together. Okay, that is all for Catelyn 9. Let us move on to the next one. Jon 8, the one where Aemon reveals his past, aka the gang gives Jon Valyrian steel. They've looked again for Benjen since his men were found, but no luck. Bloodraven's no help in that department, which might be a curiosity by itself. He has led people to things before. Not everything, he can't be a part of everything, but, blame Bloodraven is a thing in our fandom, and it's fair to wonder about his influence. It does seem to be here in this chapter in general, because Mormont's Raven talks quite a bit, and Mormont himself starts the chapter off thusly, quote,
"Are you well, Snow?"
He says he is, but he isn't inside, we know from his point of view. The main reason is obvious enough, the massive pain in his hand, but there's also some psychology, some foreshadowing, lots of Jon's parentage, and some very cool ice and fire meta here. Quote,
"At first it had felt as if his hand were still aflame, burning day and night. Only plunging it into basins of snow and shaved ice gave any reveal at all. Jon thanked the gods that no one but ghosts saw him writhing on his bed, whimpering from the pain. And when at last he did sleep, he dreamt, and that was even worse. In the dream, the corpse he fought had blue eyes, black hands, and his father's face, but he dared not tell Mormont that."
And a few paragraphs later, he thinks,
Jon did not understand why that should be or what it may mean, but it frightened him more than he could say.
I think we have a good idea, though. A dead Lord Stark rising? Crypts of Winterfell, is that you? But it's also foreshadowing Ned's death, right? There's no more Ned's chapters, and he's going to die at the end of this episode, which is just 5 chapters from now. So it's probably both. Both Crypts of Winterfell foreshadowing and Ned's death. And fire repeatedly slammed into ice, what he's doing with his fist, trying to cancel each other out. He's trying the cold to block out the heat, or at least balance each other out. Two forces of nature that need to be in balance, but they also need to be balanced out for Jon. He needs to learn who he is, but he's a long way from that. And Longclaw, with its white wolf pommel, symbolizes where he'll probably wind up, embracing his Stark side, the one he grew up with, the one he's familiar with, the one associated with the only place he's ever lived. But the blade itself was forged in Valyria, the other half of the fire/ice combo that makes him who he is. So why not have that concept reflected in his weapon? Yeah, why not? But Jon does not feel he's earned it. And because this is normally the sort of thing passed down from father to son, he ironically thinks that, no, Eddard's my father, not Mormont. You're not taking his place. It's an interesting reaction, but you can kind of understand why he feels that way, given all his identity issues. And from our point of view, his Stark heritage is hazy, but it is there. And his Targ heritage is hidden. From his perspective, he doesn't know about it at all. And his Stark side, yeah. So his view of himself is pretty similar to the reader view at this point, minus readers who don't know he's Targaryen. It's a bit confounding to his questions of identity that he's given a sword from a house that has little to do with either. I'm not complaining, just pointing out what I think is one of the many ways George set out to obscure the truth of Jon's parentage. Might as well, hey, give him a sword from some third family that's not related to anything. That'll throw them off. On the other hand, pun intended, it ties him to Dany in that they are both being mentored by a Mormont. Of course, Jorah wants to be a lot more than a mentor, but it's still a parallel. On the other hand, or white hand in this case, this is also the chapter where we learn Alliser Thorne is sent south with the hand of Jafer Flowers to show proof to the crown that whites are real. Of course, separating Jon from Thorne is a big part of the move, but getting someone else in Thorne's place as Master at Arms is a good idea too. He probably shouldn't have ever had that job. He was not good at it. The new Master of Arms is Andrew Tarth, maybe a brother or cousin of Brienne's father, but we don't know for sure.
Also Sean's sworn enemy at Ice and Fire Con.
In any case, Andrew Tarth is killed by wildlings led by the Weeper at the Bridge of Skulls at a Storm of Swords. It's the same battle where Bowen Marsh is badly injured. Of course, the wildlings are dangerous, but currently in A Dance with Dragons, they are allied with humanity, for reasons similar to what Mormont tries to impart to Jon here in this chapter. Gior starts a line of thought that culminates in Jon's final chapter with that brilliant point about it not mattering who else sits the Iron Throne when the dead come walking. Here we have something much sneakier, but in a way Gior is wrong in a way, right? It does matter who sits the Iron Throne. And given what will be needed, humanity will need to stand together. Strong leadership will be needed. The kind of thing Mance Rayder does to the Wildlings, uniting all these disparate clans. That's the kind of leadership that's needed. That's what Jon needs to do, what Dany needs to do, what Tyrion needs to do, whoever else needs to do it. It needs to be done. Sansa, whoever. Perhaps, it's a lot like Aegon the Conqueror, although for different reasons. Some people think Aegon was preparing the Seven Kingdoms for fighting the others. I don't think that. I don't see any evidence for it. But that type of leadership where everyone is fighting together is needed. However, it happens. This next quote is, it's exactly the kind of thing we've been looking for with this reread. Among the top things we're looking for, that is, which is evidence of Bran foreshadowing that we think we missed. So here we go.
We have white shadows in the woods and unquiet dead stalking our halls, and a boy sits the Iron Throne, he said in disgust. The Raven laughed shrilly. Boy, 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 boy.
the Raven, the Blood Raven, is laughing about a boy king. Damn it. Ha! George is laughing at us. The Raven is pretty talkative in this chapter, though, and that might be on purpose to kind of mask the interesting comments amongst the mundane comments. It asks for corn, which is meaningful because the other time we heard of a Raven asking for corn is in Bran's coma dream. Of course, Bran does feed corn to some of the other ravens in the tower, but actual ravens asking for corn, well, I think this is meant to be a connection. And later in this chapter, another piece of this corn puzzle is given when we are told by Maester Aemon that Mormont's raven is, quote, a rare bird because most of them prefer meat. So one that loves corn is a bit unusual and thus is part of why I think it's meant to remind us that the three-eyed crow asked for corn also. So I think this is some of the earliest evidence that Mormont's raven is a mouthpiece for Bloodraven. Back in this chapter, though, the raven also does this, which can be read as another inside joke about Jon's parentage. Quote,
I had hoped for some word of my father. Father, taunted the old raven, bobbing its head as it walked across Mormont's shoulders. Father.
I say that because he used the word taunted, right? Like taunting. Like you've got the wrong person in mind. Speaking of heads, you can read the bird bobbing his head while walking across Mormont's shoulders. Bobbing his head, walking across Mormont's shoulders, right? Foreshadowing for Ned's head being removed in a few chapters from now? Maybe. Here's another peculiar one. Quote,
altogether harder to ignore than a glorified crow. Crow? Jon thought the raven sounded fairly indignant.
Blood Raven was himself a brother of the Night's Watch, a crow himself. He might not have liked that name. I don't know. You gotta wonder why the Raven would sound indignant there. Maybe just because a Raven doesn't want to be called a crow, but he wasn't being called a crow. He's referring to Alistair Thorne. Here's another quote.
We ought to have remembered. The long night has come before. 8,000 years is a good while, to be sure. Yet, if the Night's Watch does not remember, who will? Who will? Chimed the talkative raven. Who will?
So, like I said, surely not everything the bird says is the product of Bloodraven. For example, in this chapter, he repeats the word claw after hearing the name Longclaw, and I don't think that's noteworthy. It's just evidence that the bird talks, right? I can't see a reason for that to be an important clue. If everything the Raven said was from Bloodraven, that would be a bit much. So, especially because it talks so much. It's a really talkative bird, like he says. But if this is one of those times, and I could see why, given the mention of the long night, the who will remember, that's, Brendan remembering or reminding people to remember the weapons that are used to fight, the weapons and tactics that are used to fight against the others in the long night. Well, he would agree that's important. Who will? Now, Bloodraven's presence is also remembered indirectly as Jon thinks of finding Ghost here. Quote,
they had been riding off with the other pups, but Jon had heard a noise and turned back. And there he was, white fur almost invisible against the drifts.
A noise, like I said, I maintain it's super unlikely that Ghost made a noise. The references to Ghost making no sounds are plenty, including this very emphatic one in Dance with Dragons where Jon thinks of him as, quote, silence on 4 feet. Now, he does occasionally make a little noise walking around, but this pup could barely stand on his own and doesn't make any noises with his mouth. So again, I think that was Bloodraven. But moving on to someone who knew Bloodraven in life, the scene with Aemon and his choices. This is so powerful. George really nailed it with Aemon in general, and I think that's really saying something because he nails it on the regular anyway. So he really nailed it with Aemon. And how interesting is it that vows and honor are such a big part of this chapter, right after a chapter where we discuss conflicting oaths with Lord Walder. I have to point out that in my notes I wrote conflicting oats with Lord Walder.
Very
Sounds like
fitting.
something that they're fighting over food and horse meal, So Aemon is a better vessel for this message, but it's a very similar point when the characterizations are stripped away, meaning, well, honor in the notion that Ned fathering a bastard tarnishes. Well, that's something that Jon considers, that, maybe my father, where's the honor in fathering a bastard? He's questioning what he knows. And like it does for many of our readers, when we find out, many of us, just us in general, when we find out that Ned probably never did cheat on Cat, well, that just fits better than the original notion of him one time cheating on her to do this thing. So it just kind of settles, it fits things better than the original story we're told.
Yeah, he's a liar, not a cheater.
Right? So the 3 times that Aemon refers to here, his temptations, the desperation and the bad things that happened to his family. Number 1 is almost certainly when he was offered the crown during the Great Council, the one that named his brother Egg King instead. Number 2 would be Summerhall, and number 3 would be Robert's Rebellion. Dany, of course, has so many 3s in her arc, and maybe Jon will have his own set of 3 to get in on the act. There's a lot of parallels to Jon and Aemon. The notion of setting his claim aside, okay, Jon does that in the show. Losing a lot of his family to war and murder. Hello, that clearly happens to Jon, though less than he thinks, because, he thinks that they're all dead, whereas, well, not all of them. He thinks that most of them are dead, where actually only a few of them are. Still, there's a lot of loss in there. But, of course, Aemon's family is Jon's family, too. So he loses all the same people Aemon lost. But, of course, at the time, he didn't know they were family. But one day he'll hear about that. Here's another quote.
They cut down my brother's poor grandson, and his son, and even the little children.
Yeah, his brother's poor grandson is Aerys, so I don't feel too bad about that one. But Rhaegar, that story is still quite mysterious, and that's Jon's father. So his son, that's Jon's father that Aemon's referring to. And even the little children, he says. Well, Jon was one of those little children, but he wasn't killed, of course. He's referring to baby Aegon and little Rhaenys, and those are Jon's half-siblings. So yeah, that's tight in a sad way. Now, this line reads interesting if you consider what else we see pay for life later in this episode with Mirri Maz Duur and all that. And,
A sword's small payment for a life, Mormont concluded.
Indeed. A sword is a small payment for a life, even a Valyrian steel blade. But that's also some meta if Valyrian steel requires human sacrifice. Is a life small payment for a sword? Does it work both ways? I don't think so. But there's some meta there with now that we know, or think we know, a lot of how Valyrian steel is made. That's dark. So, some other notes here from Joe in this case. A first-time reader could still be thinking that Ned will still be coming to the wall. Yeah, before Ned's executed, it looks like that's going to happen. So there's some irony that Ned is thinking Jon is alone at the wall, and they're kind of both thinking each other at the same time that they'll maybe see each other soon. But nope. That's too bad. Interestingly, though, Jon does have a family member there with him in Aemon. He just doesn't know it, and neither does Aemon. Now, a few things about Jeor Mormont here. It's interesting that he says they forgot their purpose about, burning and doing their job and all that. He had talked to Tyrion about it earlier. He says straight up, we have to not forget our purpose. So I think maybe he's doing the same thing he does by not telling Jon about what's happening with his family, which Jon knows about this because Sam told him. Either way, so we can read this as Jeor being a little bit tricky, a little clever, a little bit. He's playing with people's morale, in a good way. He's trying to fire them up. He's trying to explain why this is important, but he's doing it in a way that's, he's doing it in a way. Jon is sort of being asked to give up his Starkness a bit, in general, like Arya does with Faceless Men, and Sansa does with being a bastard and her identity. And Bran as becoming not Bran. So it's a common theme for these Stark kids. The fandom has wondered quite a bit over Jon's burnt hand here. Over time, we've learned that Dany's lack of burning is not a Targaryen thing, but, well, it's a Dany thing. It's something else. The history books have given us a lot about the Targaryens. We've been given strong evidence of their resistance to common illnesses, and there's evidence that their bond with dragons is partly literal and that they have some actual dragon blood in there, or something to that effect of a magical nature. But we've never seen another Targaryen show immunity to fire. That's only Dany has seen that. Dragon fire, wildfire, molten gold. Otherwise, it's none of it. No one's ever been immune to it other than Dany. And with Dany, it's just this one time. They can't handle hotter baths, or they can handle hotter baths. They can handle a little bit hotter temperature. That's about it. It's not, it's a minor thing. It's notable, but not, it's not over the top. So that's important to keep in mind. In this chapter, there's also the beginnings of Sam bending the rules a bit. Like I said a minute ago, he's telling Jon what's in the letters that he's reading to Maester Aemon, because Maester Aemon can't read anymore. He has to have them read to him. So Sam gets all this insider information, and that's how he tells Jon about Robb's campaign and Ned's capture and all that. John O'Donnell from Facebook points out that Mormont is more astute than he seems. Quote, "How is it that everyone seems to know everything around here?" I think Mormont knows what's going on. I think he's saying that idly to, not to call out Jon directly. But he knows. He knows Jon and Sam are friends, and he knows that Sam reads the letters to Aemon. So it's really straightforward where Jon's getting his information. Jon also points out that when he's throwing pieces of meat to the ravens through the cage, meaning John O'Donnell also points this out, that Jon's hand is burned and bloody. It's cool. It's fire and blood made real in this scene momentarily. He's got a bloody handful of raven or meat bits, and it's his burned hand. That's pretty cool. I did not catch that. Bernie L. from the live chat says, "Crows can recognize faces and bring gifts if you feed them enough. Gifts are shiny things in glass. They're so smart. I think they've seen drug deals and understand currency." Yeah, that's true. They really are. There's videos of them being really clever and solving puzzles online. It's really quite something. They're very clever. Brendan B., also from the live chat, says, "Mormont's Raven can sell you some milk of the poppy?" Yeah, I guess so. All right, next one. Daenerys 7. The one where Khal Drogo is wounded, a.k.a. the gang meets Mirri Maz Duur. Reminder of what I pointed out at the end of the last episode and at the beginning of this one. 4 of the final 12 chapters are hers, with no one having more than 2. It's kind of like her arc is filling the vacuum left by Ned's exit from the narrative. It's a brutal chapter, though. Our first real look at aftermath. But not the aftermath of war, the aftermath of slaughter. The Lazarene were hopelessly outmatched. It wasn't much of a fight. Though there was a major fight. It was Dothraki fighting each other in the Lazarene village.
Can I say something real quick?
Sure.
You obviously there's liberal show spoilers because that's what this is. I still can't help but want to say that. But the idea of Dany filling the gap of Ned. I mean, think about the role Ned played in this book about you think and then he dies.
Yeah.
The role Dany would play over 7 books.
Oh wow.
That,
Good point.
Builds her up, and then she's killed. She's not the end all heroic figure. She doesn't even make it to the end.
George is so good at that. Like, he sets up a trope to break a trope by doing another one, but that trope ends up being broken too. Or maybe even it's wrong to call that a trope, but either way, he's what a tricksy author.
Yeah, anyways, I just never really saw that similarity between Ned and Dany. How could I have until this new season of the show? Good point,
and that's why we're doing this. The show just gave us so much new to talk about, and I think that's great. I think I'm having so much fun with this. It's just little details, little tidbits, little realizations like what Shae just had is a great part of that. So like I said, there was a major fight here in the Lazarene village. It was the Dothraki fighting each other, and let's do the first line and a few after it, driving the point home about how nasty this all is. Sorry, Shae, got to read this nasty stuff.
When the battle was done, Dany rode her silver through the fields of the dead. Her handmaids and the men of her cause came after, smiling and jesting among themselves. Dothraki hooves had torn the earth and trampled the rye and lentils into the ground, while rocks and arrows had sown a terrible new crop and watered it with blood. Dying horses lifted their heads and screamed at her as she rode past. Wounded men moaned and prayed. Jaqaran moved among them, the mercy men with their heavy axes. taking a harvest of heads from the dead and dying alike. After them would scurry a flock of small girls, pulling arrows from the corpses to fill their baskets. Last of all, the dogs would come sniffing, lean and hungry, the feral pack that was never far behind the Khalasar.
Savagery is really something. I mean, just, geez, it's so brutal. Later, we're going to talk about Theon's bloodlust again, and in the face of aftermath. But this level of destruction is on another level. It's not like what we see in Westeros. Quote,
"The sheep had been dead longest. There seemed to be thousands of them, black with flies, arrow shafts bristling from each carcass. Khal Ogo's riders had done that, Dany knew. No men of Drogo's Khalasar would be such a fool as to waste his arrows on sheep when there were shepherds yet to kill."
Kill the sheep? Man, that's crazy. Just keep them. They can travel with you and all the other herds they already keep. Like, it's so weird to do this. They're so violent. Beyond this pointless slaughter is a bit of evidence that Khalasars are vary based on who leads them. We show, like Dany says, Drogo's Khalasar would not have done this. So Drogo's men are at least a bit more controlled as far as that goes. Or maybe that's just what Ogo wanted. He's like, yeah, kill the sheep. This is what we do. I mean, the Mongolians did that in some places.
He's always been called, I can't make this joke, sheep effer.
Yeah. But, so maybe the Dothraki will be under more control under Dany because of what a powerful leader she's going to be. But we're not like to see them as disciplined as the Unsullied, certainly, or even Stannis' soldiers or the Golden Company. Wherever they go, there's going to be rape and devastation and killing for the sake of killing. And that's going to be part of the price that Dany justifies to taking her throne back. And, well, there is a high cost of war. And bells, though. Bells are huge here. The bells sound for Drogo's victory, and it's told to us straight away by Ser Jorah.
He slew 2 Khals this day. Khal Ogo first, and then the son, Fogo, who became Khal when Ogo fell. His Bloodriders cut the bells from their hair, and now Khal Drogo's every step rings louder than before.
And then again, when she gets to Drogo, he makes, meaning Drogo and George R. Martin, makes extra sure that they're heard. Quote,
"He turned his head, the bells in his braid ringing softly. Is Ogo you hear? And Fogo his Kalaka, who was called when I slew him."
Through no fault of her own, Dany has a very naive view of war and mercy. You might say her view is Westerosi, even though she wasn't raised there. She has similar values. She hates slavery, which is banned in Westeros. She doesn't like war and conquest and the devastation that comes with it, but she sees it as necessary and that the justice of her cause outweighs these moral obligations. That's very similar to how Westerosi see it. They're like, yeah, well, they don't glorify, some of them glorify killing, but a lot of people, even Ned, are willing to, put a lot of people's lives at risk or have a lot of people die to uphold duty and honor or justice the way they see it. Mm-hmm. So when Dany says, quote,
"The dragon feeds on horse and sheep alike."
She ain't lying, y'all. Horse and sheep means Dothraki and Lazarene in this context, but it also refers to knights and foot soldiers, lords and commoners. And literally speaking, Fire and Blood revealed how much dragons actually eat. The tally of devastation grows larger. Like, you get these big, big dragons eating huge amounts of animals every day. That's a big deal. When a single person grows enormously powerful and has the ability to rain down devastation on vast numbers of people, their death can have a huge ripple effect. It might be what we see with Dany much, much later, but now we're about to see what happens when Khal Drogo's army falls apart. And it's interesting because a minor wound indirectly ends him. He was embarking on a quest that would have killed so many more. Many, many more villages would have had the fate of this Lazarene village until they had enough loot to get across the Narrow Sea. And then, well, we heard what Drogo had in mind for the Seven Kings. We heard the promise he made to the Mother of Mountains. Rape and pillage and devastation. His death prevented all that. Or it delayed it. Or a lot of it anyway. Or maybe just some of it. The rest, well, this quest is still being taken up by Daenerys Stormborn. Minus the slavery part. But still, there's a lot of devastation and destruction. It's a better path of destruction than Khal Drogo's was, or would have been, because at least some of her path of destruction is directed at slavers in the slave industry. But as the show revealed, she'll probably go beyond that. And if we may see something like Eternal Winter being defeated only to be faced with Eternal Summer instead, and someone decides it's necessary to take her out, just like someone may have decided to take out Khal Drogo and many other key leaders before they enacted some great plan. So the idea of killing one person to effect great change, to save others, or win great power, or both, it's a recurring theme. Whether you're Tywin arguing that killing one man at dinner is more noble than killing 10,000. Of course, Tywin's lying. He killed 10,000 men at dinner. But still, the point is what I'm referring to, not the truth of what Tywin's saying. Whether you're murdering a Khal or a king or a Lord Commander, hey, John, right? Or whether a child sacrificed to R'hllor can be justified, or killing the stallion who mounts the world before he can be born, before he can mount the world. These are interesting moral quandaries. Do you kill someone before they do this great suffering? It's what Ned said to Robert. You don't kill a child for the harm they will do. You kill a child after they've done the harm, or when they're an adult and when they're, an actual threat. In this situation, it's difficult. When you have prophecy and you have prophecy being real sometimes, you might actually know that a child can grow up to be this big killer. But can you be right? Prophecy can be wrong. What if you're wrong? I think a lot of us agree that the stallion who mounts the world is Dany. It never was Rhaego. It's always been Dany. It's the mare who mounts the world, not the stallion. But Mirri Maz Duur doesn't know that. And is it even what she set out to do in the first place? This is a big challenge, a big conundrum. What was Mirri's goal? When did she come up with her plan, if she even ever had one? There's a lot of ways to consider her arc and her role in the greater story. Even though she dies so quickly, she's sort of a starting point for this type of philosophy, this moral conundrum of sacrifice. And is it right to kill if it prevents other killings? Is it right to sacrifice yourself to stop this? Is that even what she was doing? So the effects of magic, the effects of prophecy, and the morality that's different in their world because, they do have magic. That does change the game. We can't look at it the way we look at our own world. Mirri explains her skills convincingly. Not only does she say she has a religious duty to heal the wounded and save lives, because all life is sacred to the Great Shepherd, but she describes a variety of places she's gathered learning from. And it's a big, big moment when we realize that she mentions Marwyn the Mage, the Archmaester seen at the end of Feast for Crows, who says he's heading for Dany. So Dany might actually have that come full circle. Say, hey, you're the guy who taught Mirri Maz Duur. I've got a problem with you. I don't think she'll blame him for all that. It's kind of so indirect. But that will be an interesting conversation if it happens. Marwyn has been to Asshai, just like Mirri Maz Duur says she's been. And if he gets to Dany, he could tell her some things about that. Things we're all interested to hear. Asshai was originally a bigger part of the story from George R. Martin's plan, but both the world building and the tale grew larger in the planning and early writing. So, Dany's no longer going to go to Asshai, but she's going to hear about it. She's going to hear about it from Marwyn, possibly. Melisandre's memories are another one. Melisandre's been to Asshai. She perhaps grew up there. So it still has secrets for us. It still has things to reveal. And I'm very curious to learn what they are. And, we'll just have to wait. Speaking of Melisandre, though, she talks about making herself seem more powerful by doing things that look magical. We talk about how Euron does a similar thing. But Mirri Maz Duur, I think, is doing it as well here. She does chanting and burning of leaves and things like that look kind of mundane, but she acts like they're magical. But like Melisandre, she does have real magic, too. There's no doubt about that. So let's get deeper into her intent and her spells. It's like I said, it's quite a conundrum, but it's also really fun. All the elements are here at the end of this chapter. She pledges to heal Drogo, but he laughs at the idea of following her instructions for staving off infection. Obviously, this portends far worse for his wound. Mirri is threatened with a horrible death by his Bloodriders if anything goes wrong, and they certainly try. And she gets the horrible death anyway. She's also given the job of delivering Rhaego here in this chapter as well, and she technically does that too. She later says her own life is worthless due to all else being lost. It's the lesson she inflicts on Dany in return, or in revenge, for, quote, saving her. She claims credit for Rhaego's death and the Khal's vegetative state, but I'm not really sure this was her plan from the start. Maybe Khal's vegetative state, but killing Rhaego, Well, there's a lot of issues with that. So let's, I'll be explaining that gradually as we go through Dany's chapters. One thing is that maybe she takes her vow to the Great Shepherd as earnestly as she says. She's seriously religious, quite possibly. And if that's the case, she can't kill anyone, certainly not an unborn child. And it doesn't look like she tried to kill Drogo. I think she legitimately tried to heal him. Maybe it was for her own benefit. Maybe she was trying to survive. Maybe she's just saying, look, if I heal this guy, it gives me a better chance of living. Maybe I'll be better treated as a slave. Or maybe she's just wanted revenge. But did she want revenge right away? We're talking about what happened hours after her village was burned. We're talking about, her being brought in front of Drogo and offering to heal him within hours of everything she knows being killed and slaughtered. It's a bit much for her to have come up with a plan right then and there within a couple hours when she's just terrified and is suffering from so much loss. So that's interesting too. So if she didn't kill Drogo, if she didn't go after him, if she didn't try to poison him, which I, again, really don't think she did, then why go after his child after he can't even tell? It seems like he's the one that caused all this destruction. If anyone's responsible for what happened to her and her loved ones, by far it's Drogo. And so the fact that she legitimately tries to heal him is telling. For one thing, it's hard to believe. There's a lot of these things kind of speaking against what Mirri confesses to later. So we'll keep this in mind as we move forward because we've got more of Mirri coming. So we're going to piece it all together as we move through it. All while keeping in mind what she means as a character in terms of future themes that we've discussed. Again, sacrifice, murder, the shadow of prophecy, the mysteries of blood magic, all that. So super deep topic, super fun, but we are not done with it yet. Joe Buckley points out that Iroha is included maybe to hold a mirror up to Daenerys and show that had Dany not been highborn, this would be her fate, meaning a beautiful but lowborn girl ends up as a sex slave. That's the fate of a lot of, not highborn women and girls. And, we even see that with Jorah when he goes to the pleasure house he meets Tyrion at. He's with a girl that looks like Dany. And that's no coincidence, but it also kind of proves this point. So a few other miscellaneous bits and questions. I never gave much thought to how the Lazarene as shepherds are derided by the Dothraki. They say, the lamb men lay with sheep. It is known. And, well, compare that to the early Valyrian shepherds. They were just sheep people, too. Dany's, super far back ancestors. Sheep people.
But no, it's the same. I mean, lamb men laying with sheep, as I was referencing earlier.
Yep.
They had the same idea of interbreeding, crossbreeding, like the idea of Valyrians with dragons.
Yeah, right. And
like that concept of a people breeding with their associated animal exists across cultures.
That's true. Yeah, people say the same things about the Dothraki, like they sleep with their horses.
Yeah, it's in real humanity. It's a pretty common idea.
Yeah, joking about people's closeness to animals being sexual. Yeah, you're right. Gross. So we'll give the Lazarene another 1,000 years, and maybe they'll be riding sphinxes. Something they grow into gradually.
Sheep sphinxes.
Part sheep sphinxes. So we have some gender semantics in the books regarding prophecy. Remember the concept of princess that was promised is something that's toyed with, and it might be happening here. Well, it is happening here. Maybe it's kind of a setup for that concept. Quote:
"I need no man's help," he said in a voice hard and proud. He stood unaided, towering over them all. A fresh wave of blood ran down his breast from where Ogo's Arak had cut off his nipple. Dany moved quickly to his side. "I am no man."
She is no man, and he accepts this semantics as as a good answer, and does in fact take her shoulder. So, right on. Now, here's a personal read that Dany really missed on. Quote:
"She will do no harm." Dany felt she could trust this old, plain-faced woman with her flat nose. She had saved her from the hard hands of her rapers, after all.
So, judging people too much based on their appearance is a bit of a recurring theme for Dany, which is, it's a fair thing to give to a young girl or a young boy, either way. judging people over much on their appearance is something that comes with maturity a lot of times, or rather not judging people too much on their appearance. But maybe this is what George is referring to here. Because so much of what Dany says in that moment, in that sentence, is a physical description. Old, plain-faced woman with her flat nose, right?
You know,
that's
if I had a nickel for every time my fortune cookie said, always trust a woman with a flat nose, you know?
Huh. You've actually had that cookie, huh?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Of course.
Cookies. Don't trust cookies or prophecies. Okay, moving on. We are now at Tyrion 8. The one with the Battle of the Green Fork, a.k.a. the gang meets Shae. It's also the one where we meet Podrick Payne and a few other lords from the west. The Battle of the Green Fork is the first of 3 battles that comprise this showdown of Stark versus Lannister. The other 2 battles are the Battle of the Whispering Wood, which is in Catelyn 10, and the Battle of the Camps, described in Tyrion 9. Quote, on a hill overlooking the King's Road, a long trestle table of rough-hewn pine had been erected beneath an elm tree and covered with a golden cloth. Tywin's ruthlessness is on display, so is his wealth and power, and that's what wins him the battle for the most part, because his strategy here isn't good. I mean, I say it isn't, I wrote it isn't great, but I think I would downplay that even more. It's just not that good. He explains his plan at the end of the chapter, first saying that he put the least disciplined men on the left, expecting them to break and run, and then, quote,
Robb Stark is a green boy, more like to be brave than wise. I'd hoped that if he saw our left collapse, he might plunge into the gap, eager for a rout. Once he was fully committed, Sir Kevin's pikes would wheel and take him in the flank, driving him into the river while I brought up the reserve.
Pinning a large portion of the army is a solid goal, but Tywin is foolish to assume Robb will take his bait, because even if Robb is commanding the army, which he isn't, there's no reason to assume he won't listen to the more experienced lords around him. Young men don't always listen to their elders, that's true, but assuming Robb is such a man makes little sense, especially Ned Stark's son, a man known to be the opposite of rash, and Tywin was counting on Robb to be rash, or at least expecting or hoping for it. In fact, Robb did initially want to name Greatjon as the commander of this portion of the army, but Cat talked him into a different choice, Roose Bolton. Setting aside the political consequences of choosing Roose, he's definitely not a rash man, and the Greatjon probably is. So he chooses a high-risk, high-reward strategy in going for a night attack, and maybe it wasn't the best idea. I think it was fine. But agree or not, it wasn't rash. So I don't think much of Tywin's strategy here. But like a metaphor for wealth and privilege, he wins anyway. He kind of fails upwards. And Tyrion finds him sipping wine from a jeweled cup. Quote,
The Stark boy proved more cautious than I expected for one of his years, Lord Tywin admitted. But a victory is a victory.
He has more men, they're better equipped, etc. That's why I don't mind Roose's strategy. He had to gain an advantage to negate Tywin's advantage. A surprise attack is a reasonable way to do that. It just didn't work. And to pile on Tywin's decision-making even further, he didn't consider that his opponent would get creative rather than simply facing a superior force head-on. I mean, he should have predicted they would try something unconventional because he knew that they had a disadvantage numerically. Now, some people will wonder if Roose tanked his army on purpose, which is possible. He certainly put the Hornwoods and some of the other near neighbors of his in the most dangerous spots of the battle, so that whether win or lose, his neighbors in the north take losses, which gives him opportunities later. But that doesn't mean he's already trying to tank the Stark cause. I really don't think he was. I think he was in it to win it at this point. But like Walder Frey, the way things went, he took his opportunity to stab his liege lord, his king, in the back when that opportunity presented itself. Right now, he's all about the Stark cause. There's no communication between him and Tywin. There's no, why would he expect that Tywin would want to do a deal? It's way too early for that. Anyway, back to the battle itself. The matter of putting Tyrion in the vanguard is interesting. Was he trying to get rid of him? Not only was he put in the most dangerous part of the battle, in a unit Tywin expected to lose, but Tyrion is pretty sure his father ordered arrows fired near enough to them that many of his own men were hit. Quote,
His father's eyes were on him, pale green flecked with gold, so cool they gave Tyrion a chill. Did that surprise you, father? He asked. Did it upset your plans? We were supposed to be butchered, were we not? Lord Tywin drained his cup, his face expressionless. I put the least disciplined men on the left. Yes, I anticipated that they would break.
Tywin wanted to get rid of his son without much suspicion, and if Tywin's not his sire, well, that might just be extra motivation to get rid of him. A death in battle, well, no one could accuse Tywin of kinslaying in such a case. On the other hand, did he expect him to flee? He says, I expected that part of the army to run. Maybe he thought Tyrion would be one of those people running, and as a Lannister, as like a sort of commanding presence, as someone with men following him, like this clansman and Bronn and those guys, maybe he expected Tyrion running, to encourage others to run. That might have been part of his calculus there. Or maybe it was reverse psychology, like he used with the clansmen. He was like, oh, those Northerners, they're really, no one, even my men are scared to fight them, which he used to, stoke their pride and get them to fight with him. So Tywin has, as much as I denigrate his strategy, I don't think he's some kind of idiot. I just think he's overrated.
Can I pose a question to
Absolutely.
you? Do you think, would Tywin think it was a stain upon his house if Tyrion were in the Night's Watch? I posit that he wouldn't want him in there because otherwise Tywin could have easily had him admitted through any of his actions. I think he could. If he wanted Tyrion in the Night's Watch, he could.
That's a good question. I mean, he definitely was intending to send Tyrion to the Night's Watch after the duel.
Yeah, after he had good reason. Because that was my thought here, is that like if Tyrion turned tail and ran in a battle, that is probably good enough reason to be like, go to the Night's Watch.
Yeah, maybe.
But obviously, he would have had a reason before the duel if he wanted to.
Yeah,
so anyways.
True. It's a good point. I mean, just in general, kind of keying in on what Tywin was trying to do here by putting Tyrion in that vanguard and expecting it to run. It says a lot. Maybe he expects Tyrion to run. That gives him an excuse to call him a coward and do all these other things, or maybe he just expects him to die. So either way, you could see why Tywin had a lot of things that could go right for him here. But it's an interesting question for Gregor as well. Not the running away part. I really don't think he expected Gregor to run. But it's interesting that he puts Gregor in a unit he expects to lose and run. And especially since he probably doesn't expect Gregor to run. That kind of implies he doesn't expect Gregor to survive this. So that's a really interesting thing too. The killing of Rhaegar's son is still on him, right? That's still something that Gregor knows about, which Tywin maybe doesn't really want other people to be talking about too much. The recent ravaging of the Riverlands is also something Tywin ordered Gregor to do, but he might not want to take responsibility for that. He might want to remove the witness, so to speak. It may not be enough to want him dead. Tywin later comments on how useful Gregor is, but because he doesn't want to give him up to the Dornish. But on the other hand, if Gregor dies in battle, it kind of ties a lot of loose ends up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those situations where you're not going to make the decision like, yeah, let's execute this guy. But if he's doing, good work for you and he dies while doing something no one else could do, that's fine. So let's put him in all these risky situations. And if he succeeds, all the better.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So either way, Tywin wins, whether Gregor lives or dies. If he's out there fighting, he wins, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this is the part of Tywin's strategy that I think is kind of gross, but fair to say is clever, or at least well considered from his perspective. That's removing any ethical consideration, obviously. Interesting, too, here is Tyrion's similarity to his father. It's really apparent here. Not the ruthlessness, that comes later and, in some parts before. But the pride part, again, with Walder's pride and Tywin's pride, Tyrion's pride is not to be forgotten. And, of course, Tyrion got that from his father.
A lion's pride.
Yeah, the lion's pride. It fits so well. So note that when Tyrion is told he's going to be in the van, he gets a sinking feeling. But he's not like, no, I'm not going to do that. He recognizes maybe his father's trying to get him killed, but he's not angry. It's when he hears Gregor is leading it, not him, that's what gets him to storm off. So interesting, right? It's not that he's upset that his father's trying to kill him. It's that his father didn't put him in command, which that's kind of poignant. And he did get in several fights on the way to the Eyrie. He hasn't been in a battle, though. He hasn't actually commanded men in a real battle. So it does make sense for Tywin to not give Tyrion the command, even though it's typical for these situations for there to be a lot of nepotism and favoring the nobility, even when they don't have the skills.
I think that Tyrion parallels Jon and Jon and Sansa in particular, just being whiny brats.
That's a good point.
They're just, the three of them are particularly whiny, I think, in this book.
They are. You're right. They have a lot of times they have legitimate complaints, but they also make very, childish complaints.
Yeah,
it's a combination.
Like the idea of Tyrion thinking he should be leading anyone above like Sir Gregor Clegane.
Yeah, right.
It's just like ludicrous.
He's not a knight. He's he's just Tywin's son. Like,
yeah, it's just completely ludicrous.
Right. So it's kind of neat. Like, it's easy to miss that because, heck, your father's trying to get you killed. Like, that's way more important. But like, think about it. It's like, wait a minute, why is he upset? He's upset about not being in command. Like, so anyway, and now here's the line that comes up as he's walking around by himself after leaving dinner, after storming off. This, I think, maybe foreshadows where he'll be much later, his turning on his family. Quote,
"No one looked at him. No one spoke to him. No one paid him any mind. He was surrounded by men sworn to House Lannister, a vast host 20,000 strong. And yet, he was alone."
Oh,
so sad. No, I just picture Tyrion, sad boy Tyrion, sitting there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, he doesn't belong. It's how he feels. His father insults him by saying, "Tyrion, you consult. I don't tell my plans to people who consult with sellswords and savages." But he is more comfortable with the sellswords and savages, Bronn and the clansmen, and Shae now, who, like the Battle of the Green Fork, is very different from the TV version. In the show, Tyrion's knocked unconscious by a hammer and misses the battle. Now, I can't complain about that. Battles are just so expensive, and you gotta give them a pass for cutting some of these battles. They're just so expensive. But I do prefer, and I prefer keeping characters as similar as possible from book to show. But making Shae older and wiser, I think, was a solid decision. George R. R. Martin himself is a fan of Sybil Kokeli's version of Shae, and he adds her to the list of characters like Bronn and Osha, who he indicates the show did a good job with the changes of them or making them more important. He at least likes the way the actress portrayed them, if not the changes the show made. And now, here's another line that stuck out. It's a small single line that it kind of has a lot of meta to it. Maybe it foreshadows the long night, maybe not, but I think it fits whether or not George intended it that way. Quote,
"Dusk had settled, turning all the banners black."
Ah, that's cool, right? You could put that sentence, in the Winds of Winter when humanity is facing the armies of the dead, right? Humanity is one house when it's living versus the dead. Everyone's in the Night's Watch if the others get through the wall, in a sense. I mean, they don't have to give up their families and all that, but they all need to be fighting for that same cause. So if night is constant, the long night, if it's really, darkness 24/7 or near darkness 24/7, then the banners will be black all the time too. It will be constant dusk or constant night. Pretty cool. So we got big intros, like I said, for Pod and Shae. I don't have a ton to say about Shae. I think she's a super interesting character, and the way she sets up Tyrion's arc in a lot of ways, the similarities to Tysha and all that's really important. But we haven't gotten to that yet. We don't know, unlike a lot of other things the show revealed, we don't know what George has in mind for Tyrion and Tysha, if anything. Like, will he find her again, or will his thoughts of her drive him into darker places? We don't know. So it's hard to predict, but we definitely know that comments like "my giant of Lannister," which is heard in this chapter, will come back to haunt him in Storm of Swords during the trial. Shae being frightened is a constant. That's fair. I mean, why wouldn't she? There's all sorts of frightening things going on all around. Tysha and Shae have some things in common besides being people that Tyrion had a relationship with, age-wise and agency-wise. And the song of Tysha links them also, as Joe says. On reread, this links back to Tysha, and it's just so powerful. The show and the fact that Tyrion hadn't mentioned Tysha throughout most of the book are a trick, right? Because, again, like I said, it's hard to predict where this is going. But Tyrion has so much of his arc, rotating around his view of himself and relationships with other people and his visiting of sex workers, which... the show inflates that a bit, but it's still something he does a lot in the books. And Tysha's, like Joe says very well here, Tysha is a ghost in every single one of his relationships. Every person he's with, he thinks about Tysha. And I wonder, moving forward, how much he's going to think about Shae. He definitely thinks about Shae. He still thinks about Tysha more than Shae, but he's going to have face his guilt over that at some point, I think, and think about what he's done. Joe points out that this is not a good book for Gregor's horses. Yeah, Gregor loses a few horses in this book. One that he does, at the tournament, kills it himself, and his horse dies under him in this one. Joe also points out a nice bit here. Yes, we note that Brynden Tully is amazing, but what we didn't know is that Adam Marbrand is also a really competent commander, and Brynden just outfoxes him. Adam's the one who comes and delivers the news that Robb's army had split. That should have been Adam's job to discover that. And he is, like I said, highly competent, but we don't learn that till later. So it's important to note that now, that Brynden Tully's work here was spectacular. He fooled a very competent man very thoroughly. Here's a minor curiosity I have as we move into our QA/miscellaneous portion of this chapter. Quote,
Tyrion owned a fine suit of heavy plate, expertly crafted to fit his misshapen body. Alas, it was safe at Casterly Rock, and he was not.
I wonder if he'll ever get back to that armor, and or if he'll ever feel safe at Casterly Rock. I wonder about that. Maybe at the very, very end of the story. I still think there's a good chance he ends up Lord of Casterly Rock at the end. And, if he does, he'll be reunited with his armor. Mm-hmm. Speaking of armor, Tywin's very interesting. Now, Tywin has had long since tried to tie his family to the Targaryens. He wanted to, marry Cersei to Rhaegar, as we know. And his armor has kind of a Aegon and his sister's vibe to it. I never caught this before. This is new for me. Quote,
the great cloak was held in place by a matched pair of miniature lionesses, crouching on his shoulders, as if poised to spring. Their mate, a male with a magnificent mane, reclined atop Lord Tywin's great helm, one paw raking the air as he roared. All three lions were wrought in gold with ruby eyes.
That's interesting, right? The magnificent mane that he himself lacks. He does have those magnificent side whiskers, though. Mutton chops. Interesting, too, that the core of Tyrion's supporting cast moving forward for several books is gathered right here. You got Podrick, Shae, Bronn, Shagga, Timett, and Chella even. So really, these are all the people he's bringing with him to King's Landing, and they're going to be part of his arc until he flees to Essos in a box. And even then, he's going to think about some of them and refer to some of them and wonder what they're doing. And maybe one day they'll be reunited. I look forward to the possibility of Tyrion and Bronn again, or Tyrion and Podrick again, maybe. Shagga and Timett and Chella are all alive now, as far as we know. So there's a chance that he could be reunited with any or all of them as well. That'd be cool. Our Facebook group had a lot of talk about Shae. There's some really good discussions about agency and and the importance with her character. It's partly an important discussion because, again, the show is so different from the books with her character. So she's, in a lot of ways, a very different character, which means that the discussions about her are very different, and then it's important to parse those differences. And I'm wondering, again, how much he's going to think about her in the future. I think that's going to be a thing. So again, shout out to our Facebook group. Lots of good discussions happening there, as well as on Flick, which is, the links are generally available in the description of the podcast or YouTube video, depending on which you're watching on. Let's move on to Catelyn 10. The gang fights in the Whispering Woods, aka the one where they captured Jaime. It's also the one where Cat remembers some important moments from her childhood and prays for her own child. Quote,
the woods were full of whispers.
That's one of the coolest openings to the chapter. It's the Battle of the Whispering Wood, and the whispering is a big part of it. You can hear men kind of talking to themselves, trying to fire themselves up morale-wise, trying to keep from getting scared. And it's called the Whispering Woods. It's the Battle of the Whispering Woods. It's a really cool way to start the chapter. Just a different perspective on battle. Each of these three battles that we get are done a different way. In this case, we're close enough to harm. Cat is close enough to harm that she could be, hurt in this battle, and close enough to see and hear it. But she's not worried about herself. She's worried about Robb. Whereas, contrast to Tyrion, who was actually in the battle. And the third battle, which is the Battle of the Camps, That's going to be when we hear about, after the fact, from a messenger telling Tyrion and Tywin and Kivan and all that. So we get 3 different perspectives: in the battle, near the battle, and told about the battle. And they're all, of course, almost in a row. Not in a row, but close to in a row. Between Catelyn and Tyrion's chapters, if you just look at those, then they are in a row. So now when Robb leaves her before the battle, he says it's because Father told him to let the men see you before a battle, to give them courage. Now, we've been talking about Robb and how he emulates and learns from his father throughout this episode, and it's going to last until the end of Kat's arc, basically. And there's a lot of it in this chapter and set up for more of it later. For example, when thinking of the dead after the battle, quote,
Robb looked away into the woods with the same brooding look that Ned often got.
So we see him act like his father and behave even sort of subconsciously like his father with his mannerisms.
Brood.
Yeah, the Stark brood, right? John got that too, right?
Yeah.
As Robb becomes more and more like Ned, Theon's going in the opposite direction. Robb is the Tully words here: family, duty, honor. He's not about glory. He's not eager for blood. He takes it seriously. He takes it like a solemn duty. But Theon is like, yeah, it's like the fire. It's like the field of fire. You know, it was great. It was glorious. He's just completely unable to read the room. Robb is reflecting on grief. He's thinking about people that were guarding him that died in the battle, like heirs to important houses. He's dismayed. He's not thinking about this great victory. He's thinking about the men they lost. And Theon is doing the opposite. He's talking about how great it was. Like, yeah, we won. We kicked their butts. Hardly any of our men died. But some of them did, Theon. And those were important people. And this same thing happens after they learn of Ned's death in Kat's final chapter next week. While Robb is in the Godswood with the other Northern Lords praying, Theon's going to be bragging about this very same battle to the River Run garrison. So again, he's of a different mind. Theon also, in a perhaps bit of foreshadowing to his lack of forethought and his, lust for blood, he thinks Robb should cut Jaime's head off. That's just stupid as well as bloodthirsty. It's worthy of Joffrey. That's, like I said, this is foreshadowing. It's not recognizing the value of hostages. Theon later will be told by Asha that you'll be a hero if you just burn Winterfell and bring Bran and Rickon back to Pike. But that goofball is like, you're trying to take my castle away. No, she's giving you blatantly good common sense advice, but he's kind of stupid. So, bloodthirsty and stupid. That's a big part of who Theon is. Until the Dreadfort, he stops being as stupid when he has horrible things happen to him. Instead of stupid, he becomes traumatized. And, that's a long way off. We'll get there. So just as Roose Bolton's army is outnumbered and attacks at night, so is Robb's. And so does Robb's. So you wonder some people wonder if Roose tanked his own army there, but I think is a good chance that this was all discussed prior, that Robb and Blackfish and Roose and all these guys decided that both armies would attack at night. Galbert Glover points out that Robb's army is at a 3-1 disadvantage, but Robb's army is all cavalry, better commanded. The terrain is to their advantage in that Jaime has to split his army in 3 to besiege Riverrun properly. In other words, having the advantage of 3 times the men isn't an advantage if they aren't all fighting together. And so that's what their aim is, to pick those armies off one by one rather than letting them unite, which would pose too much of a problem. Blackfish basically does what Tywin tries to do. Build his strategy in large part around the commander's tendencies and personality. But Tywin, of course, doesn't actually know Robb and makes a lot of bad assumptions about how he'll behave. Jaime Lannister, however, is a well-known commodity, and his tendencies are a lot more established. But even that, with that known, Brynden checks to be sure. He plays him and does a few testing moves, sees how Jaime will respond to raids, and then makes his move. Plays him like a master. And Robb, a young master in his own right, trusts his great uncle smartly because the Blackfish is the bomb, and Robb recognizes this, and he takes that information that Blackfish gives him and makes really smooth decisions, really smooth, confident decisions that pay off. Blackfish is really damn good. He's going to do serious damage. I've said it before. I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but the battles of the Whispering Wood and the battles of the camps are the time when we really, really see that proof. We really see Blackfish at his best, and it's not really foreshadowing for later. It's just set up for later that great commanding is still in his future because he's still alive. And, well, we'll just have to see exactly what he does. Speaking of really damn good, Jaime was too. Not in the same way Blackfish is, though. I mean pure fighting prowess and getting men to follow him. He's amazing at that. We never actually see it. We just hear about it from Robb afterwards. It's interesting that we never actually see Jaime fight other than in the tournament, which isn't... So we don't actually see him fight with a sword other than fighting Brienne. But she's elite as well, and Jaime wasn't at full strength. So what I'm saying is we really never get to see Jaime just at his best cutting through people not up to his abilities. We only ever see him fight someone that's as good as him. The only notable losses on the Stark side are the 3 killed by him. Jaime overmatching everyone in his path. That would have been kind of cool to see, but it's just something that we have to think about and kind of imagine. Same with Grey Wind. Theon, in all his gloating, describes just how great Grey Wind was, how important he was, how deadly he was, how disruptive to the enemy horses, which by itself is huge. Cavalry charges, you can't get momentum if your horses are scared of a wolf or scared of anything really, or elephants are another thing that'll matter in that, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So we didn't get to see just how nasty that was, but we know it's a big deal. We know that the direwolves against horses that aren't comfortable with direwolves and aren't used to it, they're a huge weapon. It's not about just the fact that they're, their teeth and their size. It's about the scare they put into an entire unit of cavalry, potentially. While we're lamenting not getting to see Grey Wind in action, or Robb really in action, or even Jaime, well, we'll have others to be awed by, like Brienne, who fought Jaime. Brienne's still got all her faculties, basically. And others, like the others. And Ghost, and Nymeria, and Shaggy Dog. We could see them. We could still see direwolves in action, just not Grey Wind. In Cat's last chapter, we pointed out the swollen red sun setting in the west. Now we have this contrast. Quote,
As a red dawn broke in the east, Grey Wind began to howl again.
Yeah, the red dawn, it's like the young wolf is rising. But, well, and plot lines that feature Large and his arc are rising along with him. Yeah, because, the sun rises and sets for poor the young wolf, for poor Robb. One of the setups here for his arcs is Lord Karstark's revenge. Robb points out that Lord Eddard never condoned murdering prisoners right here in this chapter, which is precisely what the Karstarks do. So when we're talking about all the ways that Robb is his father's son, well, this is one subplot, the Karstark subplot, where he is absolutely, positively like his father, just like he is in so many other ways. The Lannister boys killed are the ones captured in this battle as well. Along with Sir Cleos Frey, who Jaime and Brienne ride with after Catelyn sets them free. A lot of little starts to little tidbits from future arcs that matter here. Of course, it's confusing to have Cleos Frey on the Lannister side when most of the Freys are fighting for the Starks. But that's what happens when you got a gigantic family like the Freys. Okay, a couple of questions here. 2 more examples of Captain Obvious doing his thing. Remember Hal Mullen, who says obvious things? Well, here it's pointed out again that he does that. Quote,
"They're coming, my lady," Hal Mullen whispered. He was always a man for stating the obvious. Gods be with us.
And again, Captain Obvious rears his funny head when Jaime is presented in chains.
"The Kingslayer," Hal announced. Unnecessarily.
Unnecessarily. I love that. Also,
it's funny because the unnecessarily is itself unnecessary.
Yeah. So George is definitely throwing some comedy in there. I love Captain Obvious, and I'm glad he's still alive as far as we know. I hope he is part of the comic relief in The Winds of Winter, which is sure to be brutal and full of death. If Captain Obvious is there to lighten things up, along with people like Dolorous Ed, I'll be happy. So, Lord Jason Mallister, one of the series' hidden badasses, captures Robb's future father-in-law, Gawain Westerling. Though Gawain never actually consents to Robb's marriage with his daughter. Currently, Gawain is back in the crag, most likely. And we wonder how he's going to react to his wife doing all those things that she did while he was gone. Jaime wasn't so happy with Sybil Spicer, so I don't know what Gawain's going to think. But I'm curious what happens with him in the long run. Minor character who has some things to do, or at least to answer for. Also, from our Facebook group, John Heggie mentioned some symmetry in the manner of captives taken and how both sides react to it. He points out that both sides are ecstatic about their victory until someone shuts them down and points out that they're not being realistic, that they're getting ahead of themselves. Here is Catelyn doing that to Theon, quote.
And Lord Tywin, Catelyn interrupted. Have you perchance taken Lord Tywin, Theon? No, Greyjoy answered, brought up short.
Yes, shut up, Theon. And here's another one on the other side.
And the boy, Lord Tywin asked. Ser Adam hesitated. The Stark boy was not with them, my lord.
That's right. Too many assumptions, Tywin. So, that's that. Let's move on. Daenerys 8. The one where Mirri uses blood magic, a.k.a. the gang fights Drogo's Bloodriders. An ominous way to begin the chapter. Quote.
The flies circled Khal Drogo slowly, their wings buzzing, a low thrum at the edge of hearing that filled Dany with dread.
Yeah. Drogo is doing the exact opposite of what Mirri said to do to get healthy. So that's not working out so well for him. He's dying. The bells are still ringing in his hair. And, of course, that's in part because he can't sit still. He's just swaying back and forth. It's making the bells ring more, which is, there's probably some sort of symbolism in there. Not much time has passed since this last chapter. It says that he tore the poultice off 6 days ago and had it replaced with a mud plaster thingy instead. Now, Mirri said he needed to wear it for 10 days, so if he pulled it off 6 days before the 10 days had happened, well, it's only been about a week, or give or take a few days, so not long, which makes sense because, you know, infections and stuff, it wouldn't take a long time. Once that gets going, it's going to move quickly. So it's kind of funny, though. Well, ironic, maybe not funny. Khal Drogo, afraid of nothing, claiming to have great pain management skills, can't deal with the burning and itching of this poultice, has it removed, but is too proud to admit that his wound is worsening. Isn't that, well, that's toxic masculinity for you. Heavy emphasis on the toxic. That's not masculine to not admit you're dying. Yeah. So also interesting to compare these similar elements. Who else had a minor wound that festered and became dangerous, only to be saved by blood magic? Victarion. Yeah, he's on this trip too. He had his wound treated earlier than Drogo. Now, Drogo with a firearm, though. With an arm like Victarion. Now, that would have been pretty badass. But, alas, no firearm Drogo for us. Dany doesn't allow herself to despair. That's really interesting. Later, she doesn't allow herself to feel fear. I think this is kind of ominous in a way that I didn't notice before. It's not good to not feel fear. That's pointed out a few times in the series that people who don't feel fear are kind of inhuman. You got, bravery in the face of fear is courage. It's not bravery when you just don't feel fear. That's like a form of sociopathy. Everyone's supposed to feel a little bit of fear. You're not supposed to be afraid of nothing. And for most of the time, I feel like Dany is being brave. But there are times, maybe not all here, but just throughout her arc where I think that there's some spots where she just doesn't have fear, which you can maybe take a different look at. Maybe that needs to be re-examined. Maybe it's just her conquering her fear, but sometimes maybe it's just that she doesn't have it, which is interesting. And isn't that a statement about Dany that might wind up describing her arc really well? What I mean is seeming strong, but really it being something else. Her strength gone awry or being too strong. Jorah points out that Drogo's Bloodriders are essentially bound to die with Drogo. It's cultural, ritualistic. They have to die in an attempt to avenge their Khal if he was killed by some enemy, or if that's already done, or if it isn't possible, well, then they're supposed to die by some kind of ritual suicide that isn't exactly made clear. Quote,
the Dothraki say a man and his Bloodriders share one life, and Kotho sees it ending. A dead man is beyond fear.
Now that's contrasted to a deserter from the Night's Watch. They're beyond fear in that they know anyone who catches them will, can kill them or turn them in to be killed. Their life is forfeit. And this is the similar situation here. They're dead men walking by the demands of their culture, just like a deserter would be, but with different, attitudes. Jorah should know all this very well. This is an interesting... Jorah's role in all this is really interesting. He's condemned in Westeros himself, after all. He's a man that probably didn't see himself getting a second chance, but is getting one. And, well, he has something in common with Mirri Maz Duur, which is that she is lost everything. And Jorah knows all about that. Now, in Jorah's case, it's his own doing, but still, he lost everything. And he's finding a second lease on life by meeting Daenerys and having, some ties to Westeros and having a shot to get back there. Of course, there's nothing like that on the table for Kotho, Hago, and Khal, though. Their life is tied to Drogo, and there is no second chance for them unless he recovers, which, that's not going to happen. They certainly get their chance to go out fighting, though. Their fight against Jorah and Dany's 4 costs against the backdrop of Mirri's blood magic is pretty epic. Ago's clutch arrow to save Dany from Khal is pretty, it's clutch. And Dany shows no fear in that moment either. When Khal has his blade to her neck, she is not thinking about herself. She's thinking about her child, which I think that is very human. Mothers very often put their children first. Very often. And so I don't think this is necessarily an example of her just lack of fearlessness, but it might be both. It might be both those things happening. But you also have the sound of battle and death and her singing. It's just really, it's a really epic, scary, tragic chapter. The shadows coming to dance, my lord, to stay, my lord, right? It's what Mirri's got going on in that tent. I like to joke about that. Mirri's just like really good with those shadow puppets. She makes them look really huge. She's just got like a little miniature wolf, and she's just, it's fake, right? No, it's not. I don't think so. Even Patchface finds this stuff creepy. The fandom has long wondered if this is part or all of what he's referring to. Quote.
Inside the tent, the shapes were dancing, circling the brazier in the bloody bath, dark against the sand silk, and some did not look human. She glimpsed the shadow of a great wolf, and another like a man wreathed in flames.
Oh, that is so creepy and so cool. And here we have to look again at her similarity and ties to Melisandre and Marwyn. They've all learned some of the same magic from the same place, Asshai. So, well, are we going to see more of this? Are we going to get explanations from this? Will Marwyn tell Dany about some of this? Will Melisandre tell Stannis or somebody else about this? Maybe, maybe not, but I think we'll get more spells and more shadows, and when we do, we're going to want to look back at this and compare what we've seen. So back to Mirri Maz Duur's intent. A little bit more of the puzzle shapes out here. Again, I think her attempt to save Drogo's life was serious. In other words, she did intend her magic spell to work, though not restoring him to his former status. I think that she did know that he would not be as he was. Another thing is certain, that Mirri wanted Dany to leave the tent. But why is not certain. It might be that entering the tent was crucial to Rhaego's death. Jorah thinks so. Dany thinks so, at least for a while, if not for throughout. It may be that Rhaego would have died anyway because he was so malformed. If that's the way he was coming out, then he wouldn't have lived. But he may have been malformed because of the magic. And if so, well, how much of that is Miss Mirri's responsibility? How much did she intend for that to happen, or how much of it was incidental? As in, was Rhaego the target of her magic, or was it because Jorah carried Dany into the tent that she really didn't want Dany to be in? So, like, if being in the tent is gonna kill Rhaego, and her intent is to kill Rhaego, then why would she want him to leave, or want her to leave? So, well, from a meta perspective, part of the reason George R. R. Martin had Dany leave the tent was because it would be hard to write this from a witness perspective. Seeing the magic firsthand, well, that's tough. In a lot of ways, it's spookier when more is left up to the imagination. You know, when you see it from a distance and are left to wonder. You have the singing and the dancing and the blood, and you're like, what is going on in there? If you see it firsthand, well, some of the mystery is removed. But that's all still part of this thinking. You know, even though George has said, well, maybe I won't put her in the tent. And you can say, well, that's why he didn't do that. Well, he still has to work around that. He still has to thread these magical elements, even though he may be using writing perspective in how to arrange the scene. Now, given our calculations at the beginning of this part, Mirri has had a few days to stew over her new lot in life and what she's lost. but she's been sent back with the other slaves. She isn't around Drogo. She doesn't necessarily know he's getting worse. Dany's keeping this quiet. She doesn't know that she'll be called to deliver the baby soon. She knows that she'll be called eventually for that, given what she's told, but she doesn't know exactly when. So the timing is a little something to consider as well. Now, during the fighting, when the Bloodriders are all going at each other, when it's that, I guess you could say it's a 3-on-5, Drogo's 3 Bloodriders versus Dany's 4 Khal and Jorah. Well, Jorah says Rhaego is going to be killed by the Dothraki upon Drogo's death as well. So if Drogo's Bloodriders had won that battle, they would have forced Dany to go to the Dosh Khaleen and probably killed Rhaego. Maybe his Bloodriders wouldn't, but someone would have killed Rhaego. The point is, Rhaego's doomed almost no matter what. Now again, Dany thinks that the price is too high when she's out there getting stone thrown at her, and she's lamenting this choice, and she's thinking that the deaths of the Bloodriders are somehow part of the spell. I'm confused as to how that could be, but she thinks it, and Mirri seems to allow Dany to believe that. It might even be true. It makes sense in a way. Death has to pay for life. Maybe the death just has to be nearby. Are they part of the spell? Does it work that way? It's just really confusing. Magic is very unclear here, and it's meant to be. But that's part of the point here too. It's blood magic, and maybe it was interrupted by Jorah walking into the tent. Maybe it was fueled by those extra deaths. It's just not a precise thing in the first place, though. That's the bottom line. So when we're trying to piece all this together, that's an overarching fact of magic in this world, that it's not an exact science. It's been said in many different ways that sorcery is like a sword without a hilt. It has unintended consequences. You can't predict everything that's going to happen. So when we sit here and consider Mirri Maz Duur's role and her intent, we have to keep in mind that what she intended from the magic may not have been what happened, because it very frequently doesn't go the way people expect it to. And getting back to that, from her perspective, why would she take the idea seriously that Rhaego was the stallion who mounts the world? What are the Lazarene big on Dothraki prophecies? How does she know about this? She could have learned about it in a lot of different ways, but does she believe it? She wasn't there for the ceremony. Why would she just be like, oh, well, they believe this kid's going to be the stallion who mounts the world, so I do too? I'm not sure about that. I think she may have. We just can't take it for granted that she believed that. So, we'll finish our puzzling over this when Mirri makes her confession, whether it's real or not, in Dany 9. And of course, in her final chapter, Dany 10, doesn't go so well for Mirri regardless. So that's part of it as well, knowing that Mirri knows what may or may not happen to her. All right, so more on that later. The Mirri conundrum will continue. A couple of quick questions. A man with a curved blade fighting an older knight in armor without a helmet. That's what Jorah does with Kotho there, but that's also what Barristan does versus Kraz in A Dance with Dragons. Kotho seems a far better fighter than Kraz. Barristan beat Kraz without a great struggle at all. Now Jorah gets a little lucky against Kotho, but they both get lucky in the same way. Kotho's Arak sticks in Jorah's hip, and that gives him a moment to, finish Kotho off. Whereas that's also what happens with Barristan. Kraz goes for an overhand sweep, and his blade gets caught in some wall hangings, and that's it for him. Barristan seizes that opportunity. So some parallels there, I suppose. And I did not notice that till this reread. So score another one for Valar Rereadis. If you've read the book Dying of the Light, well, the Bloodrider Code is may have been something that George was working on. He had a proto version of it in the concept of Tains, Teyn, which is a pairing of from a warrior culture in Dying of the Light, and they treat each other, kind of like they're one life. It's very similar. So if any of you have read Dying of the Light or plan on it, well, be on the lookout for that. It's very cool. And there's a lot of other parallels to A Song of Ice and Fire in Dying of the Light, including dog hunts, skin changing, things like that, houses. It's very cool. Again, I've recommended it before, and I'll do it again. You can get it at our website, historyofwesteros.com. And our last chapter today, Arya V, the one where they execute Ned, aka the one where we learned how different this series really was. This chapter also starts a near uninterrupted procession of final chapters. Like I said at the beginning, here's the actual detail. This is Arya's last chapter. Next week, we'll start with Bran's last chapter, then Sansa's last chapter. Dany's second to last chapter will follow that. Then Tyrion's last chapter, then Jon's last chapter, then Kat's last chapter, and then finally, the last chapter of A Game of Thrones is the final Dany chapter. Though Arya is herself not a commoner, of course, she is living as one for the time being, and that gives us insight and access to a different part of Westerosi culture. That's very interesting. Quote,
"The scent of hot bread drifting from the shops along the street of flour was sweeter than any perfume Arya had ever smelled."
So she's already snapping the necks of pigeons to eat, in part because she's quite a natural at adapting to her circumstances. She's also the opposite of squeamish, and it's really hard to scare her. And also, she's starving. I mean, yeah, if you're desperate, you got to do what you got to do. Even during the climactic moment of this chapter, she reacts with anger more than sadness. To be clear, she is distraught. She is very sad, and the more time passes, the worse it gets. But her first reaction is fury, and that's important. It's it's part of understanding who she is. She keeps her wits about her when almost walking into the clutches of the guards waiting for her at the ship her father hired, which is also, part of her growth. We're seeing her adapt, seeing her learn, seeing her take Syrio's lessons to heart. Before, when she was reacting and running away from the castle, Joe Buckley pointed out how she was just falling back on the most basic lessons, sticking with the pointy end. But over time, as she gets farther into her escape, she cools down, starts to remember more and more of her lessons, and gets a hold of herself more. And you see that carrying on the farther we get into her arc. I love that the name of the ship that she's almost gets on is Windwitch, because it just reminds me of the Rhoynish water mages and Nymeria, which is, a bit of a tie-in to Arya. So desperation is becoming a bit normal for her, at least for now. Quote,
"Her lord father had taught her never to steal, but it was growing harder to remember why."
Yeah, starving, right? That's why. She mentions having eaten raw pigeon a few times before before she finds the bowl of brown, the pot shops, discovers that those are a thing. So we'll talk about adapting quickly. Jeez, she doesn't even think about how gross it was. She's like, yeah, I ate some raw pigeons, had to do it.
She needs a spear. She can start spearing some fish.
Yeah,
she's gonna eat raw something. Eat raw fish.
She needs some antibacterial is what she needs.
Yeah.
But she doesn't get too sick, apparently. So another cool thing about having the commoner's perspective, the perspective from the streets, is that we see how information flows. We see the spread of rumor. We see how it works and the way it's really interesting. Let's see another quote here.
"The talk in Flea Bottom was that the Gold Cloaks had thrown in with the Lannisters. Their commander had raised to a lord, with lands on the Trident and a seat on the King's Council. She had also heard other things, scary things that made no sense to her. Some said her father had murdered King Robert and been slain in turn by Lord Renly."
So these rumors play out a bit as she's in the crowd forming after the bells start ringing. She overhears people arguing about whether it was Ned or Renly who killed Robert. Neither believed it was the boar. They'd think, boar, no way the boar killed a king. That's too simple, too easy. They prefer the more salacious stories. One of them points out that executing traitors at the Great Sept would be unusual. Since when do they nick traitors on Baelor's steps, he says. The other doesn't disagree, but says they're clearly punishing him in some way because, he says, well, they're not going to knight him. And, well, that's rumor working for you. That's the grapevine. That's the game of telephone. Whichever term you prefer, that's what we're seeing here. And it's very realistic, in my opinion. And both of these people arguing are kind of right in their own way, as it turns out. Obviously, Ned is executed, so that guy was right. But the man who says they wouldn't do that at the Great Sept was right as well, because that wasn't the plan. They didn't bring Ned there to execute him. Joffrey just sort of took things in another direction on his own. Well, maybe with a little help from Littlefinger. Probably with a little help from Littlefinger. But the point is, the plan was to let him take the Black. That was the official idea as understood by Varys and Cersei and all the people there except Joffrey and Littlefinger. And hey, just like the show, when people were confused about what the bells meant, there were some quotes that may have contradicted each other in the show about the bells. Remember that? Well, George was ahead of everything in that regard here as usual. He shows us that when the bells start to ring, people in world get confused about what they mean too. Quote,
Is it the boy king that's died now? The king's not dead, that's only summoning bells. One tower tolling. When the king dies, they ring every bell in the city. So who has it died if not the king? It's a summoning, the fat man repeated.
I laughed out loud at that.
Yeah, great little comedy bit.
Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, so they were confused about the bells too, and no wonder all the show watchers like us were confused because hey, it's confusing. There's different meanings to those bells, so I thought that was hilarious. Now, a quick little bit of history here. The Great Sept on Visenya's Hill. Some of this we talked about in our recent episode on Old Town and Fire and Blood, but just a few little highlights from that. It started during Baelor's reign, meaning construction on the Great Sept on Visenya's Hill, in the 160s, and it was finished sometime after his death. It's a very big, large construction that wasn't able to finish just during his reign. It eventually overtook Old Town / the Starry Sept as the center of faith in Westeros. And that's a fairly recent change because the High Septons living in the Starry Sept in Old Town was, multi-century, maybe thousands of years type thing. But so it's kind of a new thing that the High Septon resides in King's Landing. Now, fun thought, slightly tinfoily maybe. Baelor had the Sept built after had a dream about it. Given the commonality of dragon dreams among Targaryens and all the other Targaryens who had strange notions about wildfire, possibly from dreams, like Aerion Brightflame and the Mad King, well, maybe Baelor dreamed of the Great Sept going up in wildfire and somehow saw this as a good thing. Maybe his dream was interpreted in a different way. Or maybe he was trying to avoid something like this. I don't know. But that would mean the Sept explodes in the books, which I'm a lot less sure about. However, it's something that George played with, the idea anyway. I mean, there are references to the Sept blowing up or burning. Nothing I can see that qualifies as foreshadowing, but it is discussed. In other words, let me just give you the examples. Tyrion later spreads a rumor that Stannis is planning on destroying it. That's part of the propaganda war between Stannis' faction and the Lannister faction. He's just trying to scare people into what kind of man Stannis is. He might not be wrong, actually. But he's not operating based on information he knows. He's just kind of throwing that out there to make Stannis look bad. And more importantly, meaning the pyromancers, they tell Tyrion that they found 200 jars buried under the Great Sept. Now, they had that removed. So it's kind of like the wildfire that could have blown up the Sept in the books was removed and left there for the show. I guess there could be another stash hidden down there. Maybe this was meant to say y'all didn't find all the wildfire. And even the show gave us some wildfire blowing up in King's Landing during Dany's run there. It just, no one talked about it. You could just clearly see green fire there. So, lot to wonder about there with regards to the future and Jon Connington and the bells and Dany in Westeros or in King's Landing and Dragonfire and wildfire and how all these things might come together. Anyway, Arya is unaware of any of that history, and of course she's never heard of dragon dreams at this point. She arrives to see a lot of familiar people, but some of them she doesn't know by name. She just knows them by look. So Joffrey, she knows, he's described in a way that, as usual, makes him very easy to hate. Cersei is wearing almost Targaryen colors again. She's wearing morning black, but with crimson streaks. Not golden streaks like the Lannisters would have a lot of times, but, if she had golden streaks, she would look like, well, the man with the black and gold armor that's standing there. And that's the very same lord raised up from the City Watch that Shae quoted earlier. That's Janos Slynt. You could see why Cersei's colors, she didn't want to match Janos Slynt.
You could say she's not a fan of Slynt?
Oh, nice. Arya sees Littlefinger, a.k.a. what she sees as the short man with the silvery cape and pointed beard who had once fought a duel for Mother. The Hound and 4 other Kingsguard are there as well. So one of Meryn, Boros, Aerys, Preston, or Mandon was elsewhere, almost certainly guarding Tommen and Myrcella. Jaime, of course, is not there either. But Barristan Selmy is. Remember that, folks. He's there watching this execution in disguise as a peasant, he later tells Dany. This is Whitebeard, the prequel, right here. As Joff makes his announcement, there's confusion and consternation. Varys sees his careful juggling act lose several balls at once. Cersei panics, seeing the immediate threat to her family, a feeling soon to grow when she learns Jaime was captured. The High Septon grabs Joffrey's cape. He's objecting to this as well. Slynt gives the order to push Ned down on the block. Littlefinger most likely smiles a huge smile to himself inside. and Ilan Payne brings ice. Like I said, the High Septon grabs Joffrey's cape. Later, he's going to complain about this. He's going to say, you profaned Baelor's steps by having an execution here. He wants concessions. He thinks that he wants the crown to do something for the faith in return for this. But he's killed by the mob not long from now during the bread riots. As a man very much overweight, the peasants do not look kindly on a guy being so overweight when they're all starving. Joffrey and Slynt, of course, are dead now as well. The latter ordered to the block by Jon Snow, as Sansa will think in her next chapter that she wishes some hero would throw him down and chop his head off. And hey, that does happen to Slynt. Also dead from this scene later are 2 of the King's Guard. Maybe both of the ones who were there, maybe not. And of course, the heroic Yoren. Most of the characters in this scene are alive still. Arya and Sansa, of course, Cersei, the Hound, most of the King's Guard. So whether they're punished for their role in this, well, maybe that's yet to come. But most, like I said, most of them are still alive. So, well, that just shows the Seven have a little power. So hopefully for Arya that she'll learn, or at least realize, that her father's words were forced. He says, quote, he plotted to depose and murder Robert's son and seize the throne for himself, which is just ridiculous. Ned would never try to seize the throne. Hopefully Arya has confidence in that later, knowing that it's all a lie. In a bit of a parallel to Jon trying to save fake Arya later, Yoren breaks the rules and involves himself with the affairs of the realm by hiding Arya from the Lannisters. Of course, it's not the first time he told Ned about Cat seizing Tyrion. That's definitely interfering with the politics of the realm. So Lord Eddard had always been good to the Watch and to Yoren himself, and Yoren just returns the favor. It's a subversion of the concept of vows that we talked about early in this episode. A theme that grows in importance throughout the series, especially with the Night's Watch, but also with the King's Guard and other vows, like Maesterly vows from Sam, things like that. Humanity tends to win out over rigid enforcement of the rules. If it's the choice between enforcing a rule and letting a young girl die, I think most of us would find that a pretty easy choice, especially if there's little risk to ourselves. And even if there is risk to ourselves, I think it's a pretty easy choice, at least from a moral perspective. Actually doing it is another thing. But anyway, it's interesting too that Yoren, when he first meets Arya, this is some things that people in the Facebook group pointed out, or maybe it was Flick, or maybe both. Y'all are very attentive and good at catching these things. When Yoren first meets Arya, she's all bedraggled and looking like she does here. It's because it's just right after she returns from being lost for several days after fleeing, after chasing cats into the basement and seeing Varys and Illyrio. When Yoren first sees her, he says, "Oh, maybe we shouldn't speak in front of your son like this." But here, in this moment, treating Arya like a boy isn't just him making an honest mistake. It's, hey, you want to live? You better pretend you're a boy. Not a smart boy, is that what you were going to say? He's rough with her, but he's saving her life. I mean, not only does he save her life, he saves her from seeing her father die. He makes her not look. He's not just saving a Stark, he's protecting a child. The empathy in this moment is really important. It's not just saving her life. He doesn't want her to be traumatized either. He's a very good man. But there's also some major foreshadowing for Arya's future. Of course, her father's death will stick with her forever. But other bits of her future are, they're mentioned a little bit here. Here's a quote.
A gull wheeled overhead as she made her way down the hill toward Flea Bottom. Arya glanced at it thoughtfully, but it was well beyond the reach of her stick. It made her think of the sea. Maybe that was the way out. Old Nan used to tell stories of boys who stowed away on trading galleys and sailed off into all kinds of adventures. Maybe Arya could do that too.
Whoa, maybe indeed. No maybe about it, really. It's a definite thing. The maybe part is whether this is how her arc will end, like we see in the show. Will she?
She's already done it.
Yeah, she's already stowed away on a trading galley and sailed off into all kinds of adventures. She may do that in the future without stowing away. Maybe she'll sail off to the west in the end. Made her think of a sea. I like the line, maybe that was the way out. That to me is pretty poignant as to how she may end her arc, the way out of society and feeling the way she feels. We'll see. It's going to be really interesting. Old Nan comes through again there because it's Old Nan telling her those stories, and that's what she's thinking about, and that's what reminds her of it. So George R. R. Martin, also a quick little moment here, also about maybe a reference to the sea. when he describes Arya being carried away by the crowd towards the Great Sept. He describes it as the human current carrying her along. So a little bit of a sea reference there. Joe Buckley says it's fitting, well fitting, that it's a quiet, gentle moment for Ned's death rather than something brutal and bloody. Even though it is brutal and bloody, it's not portrayed that way until Joff, makes Sansa look at Ned's head. Then it's pretty brutal. And what else here? It's interesting too to see Littlefinger's reaction, and one of the reasons we think we know that he was involved with Joffrey is that we see Varys react, we see Cersei react, we see several people like, whoa, what's going on with Joffrey ordering this? And Littlefinger doesn't seem to bat an eye, so it definitely implies he knows what's coming. It's one of his favorite chapters. This one, he loves seeing Ned die. Abraham from Flick points out that Arya fighting the crowd to get to her father, and no one's hardly even noticing. She's just like, pulls out her sword even, and she's trying to just fight her way through, and she's furious about what's happening. Abraham points out this might be very similar to what it's like to fight an army of the dead, with it's just this endless sea of people that they hardly even notice when they're hurt, and they just keep coming. That's pretty cool. Pretty cool observation there. I like that. Also from Flick, Tree Girl is asking questions about how we know about this execution from Littlefinger. So not only do we have this bit about him not being surprised, and the idea that Joff isn't very clever. He's not an imaginative guy. That by itself is not enough, though. I'm sure you would agree that those two pieces of evidence are, well, they're pieces of evidence, but they're not necessarily compelling by themselves. However, we have two other pieces of evidence. One, later on in Clash with Kings, Varys tells Tyrion that he's pretty sure this is what happened. He's like, well, maybe someone gave him the idea. And of course, it's pretty clear who he's referring to, the someone being. It's not Varys himself. We know that goes very much against Varys' wishes and his plans in the meantime. Littlefinger also tells Sansa that he manipulated Joffrey into having the jousting dwarfs, which both implies that he knows how to handle Joffrey, and it shows us a parallel example of what may have happened here with the execution. So I think that's pretty good. John Hagee points out that a Dothraki's horse is sacrificed in the pyre when a Khal dies anyway. Obviously, that's a reference to the previous chapter, which is cool. I guess we have a couple other mentions from that chapter here. A couple other questions that got put here.
The mention from that, these are all three comments that are related. I'll just communicate them.
Gotcha.
It was just John Hagee was talking about how Dothraki's horse is sacrificed in the pyre when a Khal dies anyway. Bernie chimes
they killed
in.
his horse, and that's what would have happened anyway.
Yeah,
good point.
And Bernie chimes in with that Mirri Maz was trying to take that from Drogo. She knew it. Unless Drogo is now riding Mirri Maz. And so John adds, she was burned in his pyre, so he's riding her to the Nightlands. And I just had to share that because the image was very clear in my mind of Jason Momoa riding that woman.
Maybe it's backwards. Maybe she's riding him. That would be a little easier to picture.
That would be easier, but I don't picture it. I'm picturing him.
That's harder to picture, but I'm with you. Anyway, folks, that is all we have for today. Next up for next week is Brand 7, the one where they go down into the crypts, a.k.a. the gang gets a history lesson.
Sansa 6, the one where Joffrey makes her look, a.k.a. the gang browses heads.
Daenerys 9, the gang helps Dany recover, a.k.a. the one where she suffocates Drogo.
Tyrion 9, the gang hears all about the Battle of the Camps, a.k.a. the one where Tywin yells, "They have my son!"
Jon 9, the one where Jon runs off, a.k.a. the gang rescues Jon from dumminess.
Catelyn 11, the gang gets loud about some king, a.k.a. the one where Robb gets promoted.
And finally, the last chapter of Game of Thrones, Daenerys 10, the one where, whoa, holy crap, dragons, a.k.a. the gang hatches some eggs. Thanks to everyone who came live. Thanks to Ashea and Joe Buckley. Thanks to our History of Westeros mods on the Facebook group, posting the chapters every week. Thanks big time to all of our patrons. You all know who you are. You make all this possible. Your support allows us to put all this effort into coverage of the books and all the history stuff we do, all our live streams, everything. Thanks to Claridox.de, Michael Claridox's maps. We're getting some love from George when we were in Ireland. That is what they deserve. We will continue to showcase his awesomeness throughout our videos. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod for the little intro music that Michael Klarfeld found for us, and to Jesse Kowal and Jesse Townsend for our regular
I set
music.
off a little coughing bout among us.
Still a little con crud going around here.
Yeah, in this house here.
Yep, hard to get over that. I got it in Europe, and it just came with me back here. Just won't go away, darn it.
That European cold.
Yeah, it's the unfamiliar type of cold. If it was an American cold, I would have beaten it by now. Anyway, folks, that is it for this time. We will see you all next week for the final episode of A Game of Thrones, and then onward for A Clash of Kings. A reminder that we'll have a Q&A episode in between the beginning of Clash and the end of A Game of Thrones that will have Lady Gwyn and Sir Buckley as live guests, which we will be taking questions and reviewing the book as a whole. That should be great. Not only should we have some great takes for you, but they should have some great takes as well, as they always do. I'm excited to hear what they have to say and to share all that with you. Until next time, you know what's up. Valar Rereadis.